All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're with you again to kick off polar bear season and our polar bear cams this week. .org, who we're working with along with Frontiers North Adventures to bring to you live polar bears right outside our window. So we have some special guests on board today we'll get to in just a moment, but we want to take a peek at what we're looking at outside there. So we have had a polar bear sleeping in that area during the day. Steve, can you see him out there? Did he move? We're going to keep an eye out for him. I know some of you got some fantastic screenshots that you've been posting. Thank you so much for that.
I can see him right now.
Looks like he might be taking a stroll, but we're going to keep our eye out. And if, oh, there he is. I think BJ's got him on the cam there. So this is on the Tundra Buggy 1 cam. So this is our mobile broadcasting studio, and we are going to drive around later once we wrap up here and go find more bears. But remember, you can always watch our other polar bear cams. So I'm with a special guest today. I'm Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International, and I'm sitting with Polar Bears International's Chief Scientist, Dr. Steve Amstrup.
Hi there.
Steve, can you introduce yourself just a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I have been with Polar Bears International since 2010, and before that I was in charge of polar bear research for the U.S. Geological Survey in Alaska. So most of my on-the-ground research in Alaska, with polar bears, was in Alaska. In my
Sorry, we're just,
my
BJ's helping us with some audio here.
Oh.
Yeah, this audience is used to our technical difficulties. Here we go.
So maybe I'll start over.
Sure.
So prior to joining Polar Bears International in 2010, I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska for 30 years. I was employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there I was doing work like radio collaring bears, putting ear tags on them, capturing them, weighing them, marking them, measuring them, and that sort of thing. And so over the course of 30 years, we learned a lot about movements, distribution, population dynamics, denning, and that sort of thing. And now I'm here in a very different environment with Elisa.
Thanks, Steve. So please send us your questions. You can put them in the explore.org chat box, and I believe also on Facebook, if that's where you're watching us today. We love answering questions from you guys. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the theme of today. We kind of have themes for each live chat, but really all our chats with Explore are about answering viewers' questions and knowing what you guys want to hear. But this year we did want to call attention to a celebration in Canada. It is really great research that happens with different universities and our Canadian government. And so we are going to be posting more about Canadian polar bears this year. And if you follow social media, if you can follow Polar Bears International on Facebook or Twitter, we have a fun hashtag right now called Polar Bear Proud. So if you look up hashtags Polar Bear Proud, we're going to be doing that for a whole year, and we love to hear reasons from Canadians, but also from anyone else why you are proud to have polar bears in your country or know about polar bears, or maybe you have one in your local zoo that you love and your zoo does a great job. So any reason that makes you proud that you know or have polar bears nearby, we would love to hear it. And we're going to be posting more photos online about that, so check that out. So we already have some questions coming in, so let's get right to those. And we're very lucky we have Steve as one of the world's leading experts on polar bears, so he can do most of the talking, and I can just send you the questions, Steve. So our first question is, how long do polar bears live?
Well, in the wild, polar bears can live up into their early 30s. I think the oldest bear that we had on record in our studies in Alaska lived to be 33 years old. But it's more typical for the females to live maybe into the mid-20s, maybe early 20s, and males the late teens, early 20s. Like most large mammals, male polar bears don't live as long as female polar bears, and this is partly because throughout their life, from the beginnings when they're cubs, males are starting to learn how to compete for each other, ultimately with each other, and that competition ultimately ends up being males just simply wear out a little sooner than females do.
And Churchill feels a special connection to Debbie, so that's a nice fact there. Steve?
Debbie was a star of the Winnipeg Zoo for a long, long time.
She was. And actually, her ashes are spread out here on Polar Bear Point up in Churchill. When she passed years ago, they brought her ashes up back home, so that's a really nice thing. All right, next question. Do polar bears hibernate?
Polar bears don't hibernate in the way that we normally think of them. when we talk about hibernators, there's kind of two classes of animals. There's small mammals, like ground squirrels, and they'll go into a lair or a den or a hole in the ground, and they'll drop their body temperature down almost to freezing. Polar bears don't drop their body temperatures like that, but polar bears are more advanced, and other bears for that matter, are more advanced in the way that they go into their den than some of the small mammals are. Those small mammals that drop their body temperatures so much periodically will arouse themselves during the denning or during the hibernation, and during that arousal period they'll eat a little bit, they'll drink a little bit, they'll urinate and defecate. Bears in dens, they'll go in and they might be more alert than those ground squirrels or other small mammals, but they will spend the whole winter without eating or drinking or urinating or defecating. So among scientists who study hibernation, there's kind of a debate. Are bears really hibernators or not? And, I think they are, but if you go to the small mammal definition, you might think that they aren't. But in many ways...
That's so interesting. In the kind of theme of dens, baby polar bears are born in dens. How big are they born? How big are they when they're born? And are there more than one born at a time?
Polar bears, and all bears for that matter, are born very small. In the case of polar bears, a 500 or 600 pound female might have a cub that weighs only 1.5 pounds. And they're essentially hairless, they're blind, and they're totally helpless when they're born. But once they're born, they grow very rapidly because polar bear milk is really, really rich. It's almost like whipping cream. And so these cubs grow very rapidly, and by the time they emerge from the den, about 3 months after they're born, that's when they look like the baby bears that we think of, where they're, maybe 10 or 15 kilograms, and looking like we typically think of as bear cubs. But those are actually 3 months old or so.
Oh, nice. They get pretty cute in those. Well, they're always cute, but even cuter after a couple months.
They're not so cute when they're first born.
No,
I'll give them that. They look kind of like drowned rats with no tails.
We've got so many great questions coming in. What is the current population in total, and then specifically in this area?
So the global population of polar bears is thought to be around 20,000, but we have to remember that that's a combination of estimates from places where we know quite a lot about bears. Like here in Hudson Bay, we know that the population here is around 800 bears in western Hudson Bay. Most of the polar bear range, we only have them and we have some idea, and add those numbers up and it's about 20,000. Was there another part to that?
And then in this specific area, how much do we know about the size of the population?
Well, the size of the population in western Hudson Bay is probably known better than any place else in the world of the polar bear. But they've been studied for a longer period here than any place else. It's a little bit easier to study polar bears in the Hudson Bay area because they come ashore every summer. Unlike in Alaska, where I studied, most of the bears spent their whole life out on the sea ice, and you always had to go offshore to find them. Here, the bears have always, at least in human terms, spent a couple of months at least on land. And when they're on land, they're a little bit easier to catch. They're a little bit easier to put radio collars on and things like that researchers want to do. And so there's a lot known about the movements, the distribution, where these bears den. And perhaps the most important thing that we know about them is because of declining sea ice, these bears that have been studied so long have given us a record of what the impact of that declining sea ice is. And over the last 30 years, these bears are having to spend about a month longer on land than they used to. And that has resulted in less time for them to feed, more time that they're food deprived, and the population has declined from around 1,200 in the late 80s to around 800 or so now. So we know a lot about these. This population is now around 800, but has changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years.
And Steve makes an excellent point that we know so much about these bears because they do come on land at this time of year, and that's why we're able to put them their main prey, seals. It's only seals that have enough calories through their blubber to help polar bears persist and survive in the wild. So polar bears in this area are used to coming on shore in the summer when the sea ice in Hudson Bay completely melts, and then it completely refreezes in late November or December. So these bears will be leaving us hopefully shortly, but they probably have at least another month or so on land. And they're here right now because they have some maybe innate sense, whether that's light or temperature or whatnot, that they're starting to congregate towards the coast. They know that this area is one of the first areas that will see sea ice in all of Hudson Bay and within their range. And so we do start to see more bears at this time of year walking through the area. And really, they're not caring too much about us. They're not here to see us. They're here to wait for the ice. But we're here to see them, and we are safe in these Tundra buggies, and the roads that we travel on are old military roads out here. So we aren't driving straight to that bear that you've seen on the cam. We're staying on the road and trying to zoom in the cam as much as we can. And then later we'll keep driving along those roads until we get to the lodge and seeing what we see along the way. All right.
I'd like to add something to what Elisa just said. So the Tundra buggies that tourists ride in and the research buggy, the media buggy that we're talking to you from now, we have to stay on these trails. And so if bears were of a personality that they didn't want to be around the buggies, they wouldn't have to be. All they'd have to do is move a few yards away into the bushes and we'd never see. And we often get, and I think it's a really important one to emphasize, that it doesn't appear that there's any negative influence of these activities, these tourist activities, on the bears themselves. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to also add one other thing to, when Elisa was talking about the bears here waiting for the ice to freeze up again, in about 3/4 of the world's polar bear populations live in places where historically they didn't ever come ashore, or they only came ashore rarely, including to create maternal dens. Hudson Bay and other parts of this sort of the eastern Canadian Arctic is what I called the seasonal ice ecoregion, and this is the part of the polar bear range where bears are forced ashore because the ice melts entirely. It's what we call annual ice. So there's no multi-year ice flows out there in Hudson Bay. In Alaska, where I did most of my research, there used to be lots of multi-year ice, and the bears almost never came ashore. And it's that way in Svalbard and much of northern Canada. The bears very seldom come ashore. But here, the bears have always come ashore. And the challenge that they're facing now is they're having to be on shore for a longer period. In other parts of the Arctic, the challenge is that the ice is withdrawing from the favored hunting areas. So in the Beaufort Sea, there may still be sea ice in the summertime, but it's a couple hundred miles offshore instead of in that shallow nearshore water where there's more seals and greater overall productivity.
Thanks for that, Steve. I think it's so interesting that no matter where a polar bear is, it needs sea, and the seasonal ecoregion is just one more reason that Canadian polar bears are pretty darn interesting, as are all polar bears. But we have a lot of questions coming in. This is fantastic. So here's kind of a fun one, Steve. I think it's a fun one. Now, would it help the species to bring some polar bears inland to breed with brown bears?
Well, there's been a lot of news about brown bear and
Yep.
polar bear hybridization, and I'm actually going to let you cover that since that was a finding of the lab that you came from at the University of Alberta. I think the short answer is that it wouldn't really help polar bears if we brought them in to breed with grizzly bears. And why is that? Those of us that are concerned about polar bears are concerned about preserving the current life form. We want to see these giant white bears roaming around in this moonscape environment forever. And to imagine that what would be left of a polar bear is a few genes floating around in an animal that's something like a grizzly bear is not really what excites us very much. So I think the answer is I don't think it's such a great idea, but you might want to talk more specifically about the most recent findings on the hybrids.
Sure. So we do know that polar bears and brown bears can, in fact, breed and have offspring that also are able to breed. But we know that those hybrids aren't necessarily very fit for their environment. There were a few, I think it was 6 to 8 bears, growler bears we call them. So when we talk about a hybrid, the father's name goes first and then the mother. So grizzly fathers and polar mother. All these hybrids trace back to simply one polar bear female that mated with 2 brown bear males. So we don't think that we'll see a lot more of this. And from what I know about the hybrids, they weren't very well suited for the ice, and they weren't very well suited for terrestrial living. So grizzly bears are very well adapted to live on land. Their claws, actually, maybe I can show you right now. I don't know if BJ's able to zoom in on this, but these bears have very different characteristics for living in these different habitats. So here is a brown bear. I'm gonna like show like that maybe. A brown bear claw.
Want me to hold
Yeah,
on?
maybe Steve against his nice blue shirt that'll be a little easier to see. There you go. So you can see how it's longer, not quite a sharp point. These are nicely suited for maybe digging, flipping, getting roots. Just way better for land. And then the polar bear claw, Steve, you made my Vanna White. The polar bear claw is much thicker. It's more sharply curved. This is really more suited for walking on sea ice and grabbing seals and pulling seals out of seal holes. And this is just one difference of many, many differences between these two species. Polar bears have weaker jaw strength actually than brown bears, not by a lot, still very strong jaws, but grizzly bears and brown bears need to bite through more meat and bone and tough materials, whereas seals are squishier. So polar bears don't need to bite as hard. They have different teeth. Polar bears have teeth that are much more suited for, I'll show you, why don't I show you our skull too? More suited for meat and fat, whereas brown bears would have and actually maybe Steve could talk more about that, but their back teeth are more suited for grinding, more vegetation.
Canine teeth are those couple of small teeth, and then there's a couple of teeth that almost have a scissors-like action. Those are called carnassials. And if I can hold up so this tooth right here, that premolar tooth, bears down on the one below it and doesn't actually hit it, but goes beside it in a shearing motion. And those teeth are like the teeth that cats have. Cats probably have the most pronounced carnassial teeth. And they're designed for shearing skin, blubber, and muscle. If this was a grizzly bear skull, these molar teeth would be much bigger, more massive, and that's because they do spend more time scavenging, breaking bones and things like that, like Elisa pointed out, and also because they eat a lot of vegetation. And so they use those teeth for grinding vegetation. Polar bears almost eat no vegetation. Sometimes you'll see them eat a little grass and things like that, but very rarely. And so they're principally carnivores, much more carnivorous than any of the other bear species. They pretty much, in fact, Elisa's major professor at the University of Alberta calls them lipivores.
Yeah.
He says they mainly eat fat. And healthy polar bears will eat mostly fat. They'll kill a seal, they'll strip the fat off and maybe eat some of the organs, and then they leave the rest. And the parts that are available for scavenging feed Arctic foxes, and they also feed subadult bears that come along and may not be quite as good at catching seals, but they can find those remains.
Thank you, Steve.
Related to that, that I've often gotten is it climate change? Is it global warming that's causing these hybrids to occur? And as Elisa just pointed out, it's actually only been one female that happened to encounter just a couple of male grizzly bears. So it really isn't a common phenomenon by any means, but if you think about it, currently the changes in the sea ice that we're seeing are most prevalent in the late summer and the fall, and breeding season for both grizzly bears and polar bears is in the spring. And so they are breeding at the time of year when there's still the maximum amount of sea ice. And if you look at the changes that we've seen in the sea ice, the minimal changes have been at that time of year. So it's not like the ice has disappeared and all the polar bears are running onto shore and encountering grizzly bears. That isn't the case. Global warming probably has very little, if anything, to do with this chance encounter between a couple of male grizzly bears and a female polar bear. I would want to correct one thing, though. Since I'm kind of partial to polar bears, I call them Pisleys.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that was an option. I do like the name better. I think it's a lot funnier. All right, well, maybe we'll go with Pisleys. All right. Well, I just dropped the claws. I'll get those later.
Yeah.
Is it true that polar bears' tongues are purple?
Wow. I guess that they kind of have a purple cast.
Kinda.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say, oh, that's a purple tongue. It's not like the Minnesota Vikings football uniform.
That's pretty neat. And how fast can polar bears run?
Polar bears, especially the younger, thinner ones, can run over 30 miles an hour for a short distance. They can be incredibly fast over a short distance, but over the long run, they typically don't do a lot of running around out here. Oh. And one of the things that our studies showed, and subsequent some of the work over here as well, has shown that they mostly just walk around on the ice. They don't run very often. Now they run. When we were doing our research in Alaska and the research that they do here, surely they run from a helicopter. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody in the audience would run from a helicopter if they thought it was chasing them. So, but normally they just don't spend a lot of time running. They will, when they're stalking a seal that's hauled out on the ice, sneak up as close as they can, and then there'll be an explosive charge to try and catch that seal before it jumps into the ice. And it's during those kind of events that they can exceed 30 miles an hour. But they wear out pretty quickly, and you wouldn't expect them to be going that fast for very long.
You definitely wouldn't want to try to race one.
There's a video that I saw years ago that it was a safety in bear country video. Did you ever see this one? And it started out with showing a cartoon character running the 100-yard dash, and it said, "The world's fastest human can run the 100-yard dash in," I forget what it was, 9 seconds, 9.1, whatever it was. And then it showed a bear running next to the human, and the bear dramatically outdistanced the human over that 100-yard period or 100-yard distance. And then it said, "And remember, you are not the world's fastest."
Feed the polar bears when they are starving.
Well, I guess that the main reason is, and this is something that a lot of people have talked about, and as scientists we've thought about it, the problem that polar bears are facing is that by contributing greenhouse gases, principally CO2, to the atmosphere, we're warming the world, causing the ice to melt. They get their food from the surface of the sea ice. So maybe if this was a transient event, localized in a small area, it would be appropriate to feed them for a while if we knew the ice was coming back. Unfortunately, at this point, the ice is on a downhill slide, and unless we take dramatic action as a global society, it's going to continue to decline. So we would end up having to feed all the bears in the world. A few years ago, I did a sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of what it would take to feed just these polar bears here in western Hudson Bay, a reasonable subsistence diet that would allow them to survive a little bit longer until they went out on the ice, if the ice was coming in much, much later. And it was well over $1 million a month. Wow. And this is the most accessible of all polar bear populations. And so if you think about the cost of that, the greenhouse gas footprint of doing something like that, because that would involve flying with big airplanes and dropping food all along the beach from here up into Nunavut, it just is not very practical. So I think that that's the main reason. I mean, it's not an idea that people haven't talked about.
Oil in the Arctic on the polar bear population.
The impact of drilling for oil is, in and of itself, going out into the Arctic, either on land or in the marine environment, and drilling is probably a minimal impact if everything went perfectly and there were no problems. The problem is that on land, when there's oil and gas development, there ends up being a lot of infrastructure, more human access, and so the humans then become more of an influence in habitats that they formerly weren't in. So these tundra areas around here, except for this little network of roads, which is very limited, and the kind of access out here is very limited. If suddenly there was huge networks of roads out here connecting oil wells, that could have a direct impact behaviorally and otherwise on the bears. And then if you're talking about drilling in the marine environment, and there's a lot of talk being renewed about that in Alaska, there's always the risk of a spill. And oil spills in the marine environment in the Arctic marine environment in particular are a very difficult thing to control. We really have no technology to get a handle on any kind of a major spill. And many in the audience are probably familiar with the Exxon Valdez and the mess that it created, the economic impact, the ecological impact. It was huge, and that was not in Arctic ice-covered waters. Wow. If we had something like that in ice-covered waters, it would be, the oil spilled off of Alaska would end up going around the world probably before it ever got cleared up.
Wow.
Difficult thing to do, especially in the marine environment. Now, I will say that the oil companies that have worked on the North Slope of Alaska have done a really good job of being good neighbors. And we have not measured an impact of oil and gas activity from that land-based oil and gas activity. And when bears come ashore and interact with the people, they're doing a very good job of keeping the bears and the people separate and not interfering with the bears. So it is possible to do it, but you have to think of all the variables, and they've had a lot of time in Alaska to think of the variables. And then if you move offshore, it's a different ballgame.
Right. Well, it's good to know that there's some success stories out there and people are taking the polar bear seriously and doing what they can.
Yeah, when I worked in Alaska, we partnered a lot with representatives from the oil and gas companies, and they still are major supporters of some of our work at PBI. And they are doing a really good job of minimizing their footprint, minimizing their impact, not only on polar bears, but on all of the wildlife up there, because it's important for them to put forward a position that, we're after this one resource, but we also want to minimize the impact on these others, and we know that sometimes there could be conflicts. So it can be done. It can be done if there's a lot of care. In the marine environment, it will be a lot more difficult.
Okay. So I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if you do, Steve, but it's an interesting question.
Very thin ice. And I've experienced this a couple of times catching bears in the fall of the year in Alaska when the ice was so thin that when we landed the helicopter, and we had a helicopter with fixed floats, so even if the ice broke through it, it would float. But we landed the helicopter, and the ice would bow down like this, because saltwater ice is flexible. It's kind of got plastic characteristics compared to freshwater ice. If you put too much weight on it, it just breaks. Saltwater ice will first deform. Okay. But there were a couple of times that we darted a bear that got into some of this really thin ice, and that bear was just walking along, and we thought, wow, we should be able to do that. And we landed, and the helicopter floated because it was on the floats, big surface area, and we got out and right away started to punch through. Gosh. So we had to figure out creative ways to handle those bears. After having that learning experience, we were a little bit more careful in how we, how we handled or how we darted bears and make sure that they couldn't get to that skinny ice. But I suppose that an adult bear can walk on ice that's only a couple inches thick.
Wow.
But an adult person, maybe not so much.
That's amazing. And part of that is because of the size of the polar bear's paws. Is that right? They just even out their weight over all their giant paws. Yeah. And next time I'll show you a paw cast, but their paws are bigger than my face pretty easily. And we've also seen out here before too the polar bear starfish. Have you ever seen that? When they can really spread their legs out and kind of shuffle around almost on their bellies. It's neat to see them get across that really thin ice occasionally. About Hudson Bay though, so the salinity of Hudson Bay and the surrounding water around here, what is the freezing point temperature for Hudson Bay? So I guess how cold would it have to be for this salt water and brackish water around here before it actually freezes into ice for polar bears?
In general, salt water freezes at, I think it's 28 Fahrenheit, which is what, -2 or thereabouts, -1.5 Celsius, something like that. So quite a bit below the freezing level of fresh water.
Right.
And so some people wonder, well, if it's hanging around freezing temperature, why don't we have ice on the bay?
Right.
And it's because it's just not quite cold enough yet. But also, very importantly, is there's a lot of latent heat that's built up in the ocean water over the course of the summer. So even if the air temperature is quite cold, it still takes a while for the sea ice to respond. Now, if you had just a little bit of salt water in a dish, it would freeze at 28 Fahrenheit or something like that.
Okay.
But the ocean, to get this bay to freeze out here, we're going to have -10, -15, -20 for a while for it to freeze up.
And we're not quite there yet. It's going to be at least
to go.
a few more weeks at least. Okay. Steve, so maybe we'll wrap up on this question, but we are going to be around for the rest of the day, checking out the comment board online, and then we're around for the rest of the week. Our next official live chat is next week, but we are available. We're going to be plugging in the microphone. We can do voice.
Is to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide, and what that means is lowering our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, that doesn't mean we won't use oil and gas for a variety of things. We'll be dependent on oil and gas for a long time to come. But we need to be more careful, more judicious in how we use them. And in fact, in many ways, oil is too valuable to burn. I mean, think of our lives without plastics and other things that are products of the hydrocarbon industry. But we need to burn fewer fossil fuels, and we need to contribute less CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's what we really need to do. If we continue on our current path, and that is without doing serious mitigation, serious lowering of the amount of CO2 that we emit, if we don't do anything, we're on a path that could see polar bears disappear in 100 years. I projected that in 2010 in a paper that was published in Nature, and nothing has been published or developed since then that really changes that trajectory. So in that sense, polar bears are severely threatened right now. And one of the things that I like to say is, if you think about it, polar bears in the United States are classified as threatened. They're not yet classified as endangered. But given the fact that we're on a trajectory of them going downhill until they hit bottom, what is the difference between having a species described as threatened versus endangered? You could think about this as if somebody pushed you off of the top of a 100-story building. Are you threatened until you
Help protect them. Yeah.
Absolutely, and so maybe we could close with this, that we're currently on a path that could see polar bears disappear in 100 years. If we changed our ways, if we actually adopted and set a path towards the goal that was established at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, if we got on a track and met that goal of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, we would preserve polar bears over most of their current range. And I think that that's a really important take-home message. We have the ability to do this. We're not on a good path right now, especially in the United States, with our current president having pulled us out of the Paris Agreement and done a lot of other things that are derailing our efforts to minimize carbon CO2 production. But we have the ability, and if we get on that path, we can save polar bears, and saving polar bears will benefit the rest of life on Earth, including us.
Yeah, it really means saving ourselves, too.
That's right.
And check us out. In less than 2 weeks, we will be doing a couple things with the COP23 conference in Bonn, Germany this year. So that climate conference this year will be kicking off. There's going to be a lot of discussions around involvement, I'm sure. And so keep watching, and we'll be talking to you guys about that as well. So thank you so much for all your questions today. Thank you for joining us on Buggy One. We're going to keep rolling. We're going to get you closer to some polar bears. We're here to answer questions online and over the cam in the next few days. And thank you, Steve, so much for being here with us today. It was really big treat for us and for me to have you here to answer these questions. So thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest Polar Bears International live chat. Live from Tundra Buggy One on the shores of Hudson Bay near Churchill, Manitoba. And we are coming to you again from the heart of the polar bear migration. We have been surrounded by polar bears really all day. This morning was one of the best bear days I've had so far this season. It was pretty exciting. We had bears all around Buggy One and around the lodge where we slept and ate breakfast last night and saw the amazing northern lights. I saw some of your posts on the Northern Lights cam, which were totally incredible, so thanks for sharing those. And then some fantastic snaps from the polar bears this morning. We had a whole mix. We had some young bears, we had some skinny bears, and we had probably the fattest bear I have ever seen up here at this time of year. And I think someone called him the J-Lo bear because his bum was bouncing so much with all the fat. Andy, you thought that was a pretty fat bear too, didn't you?
That was a bear that did really well this last spring, and it's interesting. We always sort of focus on the skinny bears, and we always think, oh, bears are all doing poorly. But even in years when the bears are doing poorly, there's always some bears that are doing better. And it was interesting because right after we saw, this really big bear, we saw another bear that was clearly running out of energy. So it's again, we think about polar bears being sort of like, the old bell curve. Most of the bears are in the middle. There's some really fat ones, and there's always some really skinny ones. And the bears are actually doing a lot better this year. But that's probably tied to the conditions that made eastern Canada and eastern U.S. so very cold last winter. It was actually good for the bears here. The problem is, one good year doesn't change really the long-term declines that we've seen in this population.
Well, it's sure been interesting to see that sort of variation so far this season. There's no signs of ice out here quite yet, but we are nearing the time where the bay will freeze over and the bears will leave. We should have them out here for at least another couple weeks though, so we'll be keeping an eye on them and continuing to talk to you over the internet and in the comments. And we've also been doing voiceovers this week on the Tundra Buggy Cam, so stay tuned for more of those. Now, for those of you that maybe haven't joined us yet this week, maybe I'll do just, in case you haven't figured it out, that was Dr. Andy DeRoche, a polar bear scientist. Andy, is there anything you want to say about can you just tell the audience that doesn't know you a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a prof at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I've been there for about 13 years as a prof. Before that, I spent 7 years as the Norwegian Polar Institute's biologist in Tromsø, Norway, so living north of the Arctic Circle and studying the polar bears of Svalbard. I've worked in various parts across the Arctic. I've worked in areas of population ecology, ecotoxicology, behavior. Pretty much if it's anything to do with polar bears, I've probably looked at it or one of my students have.
Thank you. Well, we are sure lucky to have Andy up with us this week. So if you have any questions about polar bears, please let us know. But today we have a pretty cool topic. Polar Bears in Berets was the title. And for those of you wondering what the heck does that mean, we are talking about the Paris climate talks today. And so we are very lucky to also be joined by Cassie Siegel, who is a lawyer with the Center for Biological Diversity. Cassie, can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your expertise?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I work on projects to protect species like the polar bears that are threatened by climate change, and also on the solutions to climate change to help us reduce emissions and solve this problem. And that covers a very wide array of things, for working on stronger standards to reduce greenhouse pollution from cars and trucks and airplanes, to all kinds of things, trying to keep fossil fuels in the ground, transition to renewable energy, and of course, working to protect these bears.
Which is just so important. So maybe before we get into the bridge between Paris and polar bears, maybe you would be able to give us a little bit of context on what these COP21 talks are. What does COP mean, and what's the history of this kind of event?
Yes, definitely. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is an international treaty that was signed and ratified by nearly 200 countries around the world, including the United States, in 1992. And the basic agreement in the UN Framework Convention is that all the countries of the world agree to work together to avoid dangerous climate change. And they also agreed at that time that the most wealthy countries of the world, the ones that had done the most to cause the problem of climate change, would take the lead in fixing it. So in 1992, the U.S. signed it, the U.S. ratified it, and ever since then we've been working towards the successor agreements that actually specify how we're going to avoid dangerous climate change and what we're going to do, how much each country is going to do to reduce emissions. The first agreement was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and the developed countries of the world, the wealthiest countries, agreed in 1997 to reduce their emissions by an average of about 5% between 1997 and 2012. The United States, for all the Americans out there, signed the treaty in Kyoto, but never ratified it. So international treaties, they are generally signed by the president or his representative and then ratified by the Senate. So the Kyoto Protocol went into force in 2005 without the participation in the United States. And what we've been working for ever since is a new agreement that the U.S. and everyone else will participate in for what we do going forward from here.
Thank you so much for that. So you have 3 kind of points you told me about when you talk about what makes legislation or these things that actually matter. Can you tell us a bit about your 3 big things that you're looking for?
Yes, definitely. So when you're looking at the news coverage of everybody going to Paris and these big 2 weeks of negotiations going on, what are we looking for? What do we want to come out of this conference? And we want the next treaty to be fair, to be ambitious, and to be binding. So we can talk about each one of those in a little more detail if you want, but the fairness indicates that there is a fundamental justice issue at the heart of all this, because the truth is that climate change poses the most dire threat to the people in the countries that have done the least to cause it. So if you live in Bangladesh or if you live in a low-lying nation, you have not, your country's not responsible for a very big percentage of emissions that have caused the problems, but you're facing enormous changes and threats right now. It has to be ambitious because we have to do what the science says we need to do to solve the problem. I love how Bill McKibben always says, you can't negotiate with the physics and chemistry of the climate system. We know that we need very deep and rapid greenhouse reductions to slow sufficiently to avoid the worst damages of climate change.
One of the reasons we are very concerned about polar bears is that they live on the sea ice, and the amount of sea ice, the distribution, and the character of that habitat is dictated by temperature. And so in my research group, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out just how much ice needs to be in a place in a given year for bears to thrive. And it's clear that we're getting closer and closer year over year to getting to the point where there's not enough ice for polar bear populations to persist. So there's a lot of noise in the data, but there's good years and bad years. This turns out that it's a little bit better year, but more or less it's a habitat loss issue. It's the same thing that threatens species around the world. The problem with polar bears is we can't just put a fence around their habitat. We can't just make a park. We can't somehow protect sea ice unless we deal with the issue of climate change. And this is where COP21 presents a new opportunity to go forward and get some serious direction on dealing with this problem. I'm fairly optimistic, I'd say, right now. We've got a new government in Canada, and actually in my province in Alberta, governments are catching on that this is a serious issue, and for the first time, I'd say, in the last decade, has a new direction forward, and I'm optimistic that we'll be an active participant going forward. And it's really an important time, and it's like I tell all my undergraduates when I'm teaching at the university, I'm going to be fertilizer by the time you guys are paying for this, and it's time that we start putting a price on carbon, and how we do that is part of what COP21 is going to figure out.
And as part of Polar Bear Week, which is this week from November 1st to 7th, Polar Bears International has an online petition to instate a carbon tax in the United States. If anyone of you over 18 wants to sign that to help support polar bears. So thanks very much, Andy, for that connection. And we will be circling back to the Paris climate talks very shortly, but we'll just take a couple questions that we've had come in over the last couple days. One question, Andy, which I think it's pretty interesting. Someone is wondering about the history of this area. How did the military get involved? We're using the military roads here. Has that impacted the polar bears at all? And have we used any of this infrastructure to study polar bears over, 40 decades or something?
Yeah, well, to start with, of course, we used to have Fort Churchill. So there's the town of Churchill, and then closer to the airport, there was a military installation here, and it was pretty active. It shut down before I came here, which was in the mid-1980s. When I first came, lots of old military buildings. I mean, actually, the Polar Bear Jail is actually a remnant of the military installation. People here, you can go out on the Tundra and you can see where they would take large vehicles over the Tundra. The Tundra is an incredibly fragile environment, and a lot of those vehicles were there 50 years ago, and you can still see, it looks like they drove through there yesterday. So they were all through this area. The Churchill Denning area was actually part of a rocket range, so they were testing rockets in that part of the world. That was for studying the Aurora Borealis or Northern Lights, but some of it was just testing different sorts of munitions. There was a firing range. It didn't have a huge effect on the bears unless the fact that they were shooting bears, and there's no question. I've talked to various military people here, and polar bears were sort of seen as a bit of a problem animal at that time. And so there were lots of bears shot and skinned out, and they just left on military planes heading south, and I'm sure lots of high-ranking officers got their polar bear hides from Churchill. We know that. How many? We don't know. It's quite clear that it had an impact, but it was clear also that local people didn't want polar bears around, so back in the 50s, 60s, and earlier than that, it was basically free hunting season on the bears. Anybody could shoot one, and nobody really cared. So, that attitude has changed quite dramatically. It is really a different part of the world now. The province of Manitoba has put a lot of effort into trying to deal with bears and to reduce human-bear conflict. So it's kind of interesting. The Churchill Northern Study Center, which is just straight south of where we are, is actually on the old Churchill rocket range, which also was used to some extent by the military. And it was, again, it was part of a bit of a Cold War installation. There's still remnant buildings throughout even the Denning area further south. There were listening posts, when everybody was worried about, Russian forces coming over the pole, or actually USSR back then. Fortunately, that's all faded away, and most of those areas are now held in Wapusk National Park.
Interesting. And the Cape Tower, BJ has talked a little bit about that before on live chats, how the Cape Tower has been used for some research, and you've done some research out there as well.
Yeah, that tower was originally put in by Dr. Ian Sterling with Environment Canada, and Ian Sterling, most of us know, is sort of the godfather of polar bear research around the world. He's still very active in polar bear research, although he's been retired for a number of years. And Ian put that in because polar bears, of course, have lots of interesting behaviors at this time of year. They were very poorly understood in the early 1970s. And so they put that tower in. They brought in a crew. It's actually an old fire outlook for looking for forest fires. And so they brought that in, put it in, and we're doing behavioral observations from up there. And so there was a fellow by the name of Paul Latour who was looking at behavior, the sparring behavior, the fighting behavior of the bears, but also the spatial distributions and what we call the time budget, just how bears were using their time. So it has been used after that periodically. Various film crews have been out there trying to take movies of bears. I was out there testing polar bear deterrence back in 1985, so I spent a month up in that little tower. It was pretty fun. It was like those old cartoons, where Tweety Pie, and Sylvester the cat's always trying to get him. It kind of felt like that. Like we were sitting up in this tower, and you'd wake up in the morning, there'd be a huge bear standing down below and just kind of banging on the edge of the tower. And it was almost like they wanted to shake you out of there. And they knew we were up there, and they could probably smell our bacon and sausages. So pretty, but we were testing these non-lethal plastic bullets to see. It was some of the very earliest things. We were looking for ways to not have to hit the bears with too much, but bears understand physical pressures like that. And prior to that, they were using basically these big rubber bullets, and those were really dangerous for the bears. And so they were looking something that would hit the bear, but not so hard. And And so I spent a month up there. It's an interesting place, for sure. 40, 50 polar bears all surrounded beneath you there. There's not quite as many bears in that area now. This population has declined quite a bit in the last 30 years.
What an experience. Holy cow. And did you see, so people are really interested in the sparring that goes on in this area. Was there much sparring out there? And can you maybe talk about what is going on when bears start sparring?
Well, it's a behavior that we think is probably pretty adaptive. These bears are quite often very close in body size. So when you watch a bear that comes up to another, they're sort of sniffing each other over, but they're sizing you don't want to fight with somebody too much bigger than you. So you're trying to find somebody that's pretty even match. And what we think they're doing is either they're trying to get like a loose dominance hierarchy, so trying to figure out where they fit in this system. If a bear looks like this, is it that much stronger than me? And the whole idea is that this time of year, there's no resources to fight over. There's no food of any significance, and there's no mates. But in the springtime, when there is food and there are breeding opportunities, bears that will play fight and try to build up their skills and repertoire will basically they'll tear each other apart out on this.
Like China are growing rapidly, and I always just have to note how unfortunate it is that the United States, after signing the Kyoto Protocol, then pulled out and didn't meet its commitments, because a big part of those commitments were to fund clean development in the developing world, because we knew back then that this was going to be a big problem. But when the U.S. reneged on its commitments, it made the problem worse in places like China and India. And so, yes, this is a global problem, and yes, we do need emissions reductions globally, but how we do that is one of the big issues, and why it's difficult to get an agreement. The other thing to keep in mind is that China's emissions do look like they're growing rapidly based on the way we track them. But bear in mind that a lot of China's emissions is manufacturing and coal-fired power, and those goods are overwhelmingly shipped to North America and the United States for consumption, and yet all of those emissions go on China's balance sheet. They're not counted on our balance sheet, even though we consume them. So I think that it's really important to keep in mind the fairness issue and also the urgency of the problem. And the number one thing that wealthy countries like the United States can do now is to put strong science-based commitments on the table and be willing to work with other countries so we can all do it together, because we can, but it takes everybody working together. And unfortunately, and I say this as an American activist, the United States has been quite a barrier to progress in the past, and we simply have to change that.
Oh, thank you for that. We have another question, kind of about our involvement, but I know Cassie knows a bit about this too. Does PBI work directly with the EPA in the U.S. or with government agencies directly in trying to help spread the word about conservation and the effects of climate change? So something we do at PBI, we do not work directly with the EPA, but a large part of what we do is partnering with other organizations that do have the spread of education and conservation. So the Center for Biological Diversity are good friends of ours. We also work with Discovery Education Network. We work with Taking It Global. We have a lot of different partners that we meet up with and work with closely together to try to talk to kids and adults and spread the word about the importance of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And we can always do better, and we're always looking to work with more people and get more involved as we continue to grow. So thank you very much for your question. And we also love staying in contact with our audience. So if you guys are doing things in your own lives, or if you have ideas of things we can be doing, please always let us know. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at Polar Bears, and we love hearing from people who like polar bears. So anytime you want to chat. So we have, let's see if we've got another question here. Andy, we've had some questions come in previously about the Arctic fox, and I know a little bit about the Arctic fox, but not a lot. Can you tell us, people see it once in a while on the cams, and it's kind of small. What is it eating out here, And how do they make a living?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of I mean, I love Arctic fox. I mean, they're such a cool little, it's like a spring-loaded animal. They're just kind of skipping around out here everywhere. And the neat thing about them is, again, it's largely a terrestrial mammal. They live in on land, and they den on land, and they're an Arctic species. They're found across the circumpolar north. There are a few on the mainland in Europe, and those ones aren't doing well. They're actually being quite heavily threatened by climate change there. This is a species that lives when it's on land, feeding on basically birds' eggs, goose eggs particularly are important in this area. Young goslings, when they're just recently hatched, they're easily caught, and then the bears bring them back to, the foxes bring them back to their dens. They also rely on small mammals, so voles, which are just tiny little mammals, and lemmings, those are two really big ones. And the interesting thing about Arctic fox is they really track their prey. What we see is that the populations of foxes do really well when the small mammals are very abundant, and basically they turn on and have lots of offspring. They can have up to a dozen or so offspring in a single year. And so all of a sudden, in years when there's lots of small mammals, you've just got Arctic fox everywhere. And then when the small mammals crash, they just disappear almost. We saw one this morning just around breakfast time, but that's the only one we've seen recently here. The interesting thing is that these foxes in the wintertime will head out onto the sea ice. If small mammals are less abundant, so there's very few voles and lemmings, they'll head out onto the sea ice, and actually they'll look for the leftovers that polar bears leave behind after they feed on a seal. Of course, the polar bears take mostly the fat, they leave all the meat, so the Arctic fox come out there and have a great time feeding on what's left. They are actually fairly good predators of ring seals in the springtime as well. So ring seal pups are born quite small, and the Arctic fox will actually dig into the ring seal dens, and they can actually be quite effective predators on ring seals. But they're, again, it's kind of one of these species that will be affected and are being affected by climate change. There's I think of the photograph of Arctic fox being killed by a red fox that I think won first prize for the BBC wildlife photographer this year. You know, and that's one of the problems. So climate change is going to be great for red fox. They're a species that deals better with warmer conditions than the Arctic fox. So we expect that red fox will expand northward, Arctic fox will keep retracting northward, and that's the scenario that's threatening Arctic fox in the mainland of, mainly in Scandinavia, where they live very high up in the mountains where it's quite cold, but as it's warming, the tree line is moving upward, and we're getting better habitat for red fox, which can directly kill Arctic fox or are just competitors for habitat.
Great, thanks, Andy. So I've got a polar bear question for you, but kind of bigger picture. Will the countries with polar bear populations coordinate with each other during the climate talks to discuss polar bear conservation? Very good question.
We've just, the 5 circumpolar nations with polar bears, so that's Canada, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and the US. We all got together to coordinate a circumpolar monitoring and research plan for polar bears. And that's just been written up this year. So that was done under the auspices of the International Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears. It's a 1973 agreement. And I would say that that's probably the more important venue for dealing with polar bear conservation at that sort of level. But what we need is a much higher level plan to deal with the climate change issue. So there's nothing about the range states, is what we call them, for polar bears, nor the 1973 agreement. While it does say we should conserve their habitat, of course nobody was really envisioning climate change back then. So the COP21 in Paris is really the mechanism going forward that polar bear scientists and managers need, that sort of direction to be able to assist the long-term conservation of this species. So I'd like to think that the 5 Arctic nations with polar bears are going to work together and pull in the same direction. That's the most optimistic outcome, and certainly polar bears are in the back of everybody's mind, just because they've become such an icon of climate change. And the reason for that is that we understand the science of polar bears very well. We understand the science of what's happening to sea ice and its link with climate and temperatures. So it's an easy story, but the only way that we can fix it is by dealing with this at very high levels and getting everybody on the planet to pull the same way.
So kind of in that same vein, and I think you might have already touched on this, but another question is, I saw an article where they mentioned that Greenland has some icebergs or snow that is melting. Any thoughts on what might be contributing to that?
Well, I'm not a glaciologist. I do study sea ice a lot, but I know when you look at the glacier record from around the world, most glaciers are losing mass, and most of these glaciers are losing mass because it's warming. So it's a question of temperature, and the Arctic and northern areas are warming much faster than lower latitude areas, and so what we're seeing are the symptoms of climate change played out in these high latitude areas, and glaciers are one thing that we can measure and follow the changes quite clearly. It's a big concern because a lot of parts of the world rely on these glaciers for their fresh water, and a lot of the fish species that live in these rivers are there because they create a very cold water environment. So where I live in Alberta, the recent years they've shut down all the fisheries on the east side of the Rockies because the rivers are just too hot. Even though these are catch and release fisheries, they've just shut them down because the fish can't take the stress of being caught when the waters are that warm. I think if we don't deal with the climate change issue now, 30, 40 years from now, we're not going to be worried about polar bears or fish in streams. We're going to be worried about finding water and dealing with food and displaced people. So we've got an opportunity this year to do the right thing and put us on a path. I don't think we're going to get all the answers, but I'm hoping we at least take some of the steps in the right direction.
Thank you for that. So true. And another group that we partner with at Polar Bears International is AZA, so the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And we have Arctic ambassador centers throughout the world, but many in the United States. I would encourage you to check out to see if you have any Arctic ambassador centers near you. These are often places that have polar bears, but not always necessarily. But to be an Arctic ambassador center means that we work closely with them to make sure that they have materials for about polar bears and climate change and tools that they can give the communities, and that make sure that they're working with the communities to lower greenhouse gas emissions and their carbon footprints. And there's many throughout the states. Zoos bring in over 180 million visitors a year, which is pretty incredible. So they are crucially important in the education about conservation and stopping climate change. So check those out if that interests you at all. And we have another couple questions about polar bears. One is asking, yesterday, Andy, you mentioned rising levels of mercury in polar bears. Is this a major concern, and is it because polar bears are at the top of the food chain?
It's exactly because polar bears are at the top of the food chain, and so of course that leads to the question of why are mercury levels rising, and it's largely coal burning. So it's interesting that, we're talking about burning coal, producing carbon dioxide, which is heating up the planet. But one of the things, when you burn a lot of coal, you release a lot of mercury into the environment, and of course it goes up into the atmosphere. Then it gets into the north where it's colder. It tends to drop out of the air masses, ends up on the snow melts, ends up in the ocean, it ends up in the food web, and then of course it gets what we call biomagnified up in the food chain and ends up in polar bears in quite high levels. Mercury is not a good thing. We know that from lots of experiments on wildlife and inadvertently humans. Minamata disease is mercury poisoning. That was discovered in Japan. What it does to polar bears, we don't know. We have some indications that it probably has negative effects. But the problem with polar bears is that it's not just mercury, it's not just things like DDT, which we still find in polar bears, and the residues of DDT, DDE. We have, I would say conservatively, somewhere around 400, maybe 800 different chemical compounds of anthropogenic or human origin that are in these bears. So, you know, it's like some of you might be familiar with PCBs. They're now banned in most developed countries, but there's tons and tons of it in dumps that are slowly leaking out into the environment. When you say PCBs, you think that you've got like one chemical. There's actually over 200 different types of PCBs, depending on how many chlorines and the position of those chlorines. And each one is a little different in its toxicity and its chemistry as well. Then we've got brominated compounds. Brominated compounds are all over your houses and your electronics. They're flame retardants. We've got fluorinated compounds, and a lot of these compounds are built to be very chemically stable. Because they're stable, they get into the environment and they don't break down, and then of course they get transported to the Arctic in all sorts of different mechanisms. And it's a concern. It's an ongoing concern, and one of the problems is there are interactions with climate change. So as bears become more nutritionally stressed, burn down their fat reserves, more of the pollution in their fat is actually released in their bloodstream, which is where it's going to be metabolically active, and it can interfere with the immune system, the endocrine system, so your hormone levels. It can affect development and growth patterns, learning in individuals. So it's a complicated system, and there's you know, we focus on climate change as the number one issue, but it's really that there's other threats, you know, development, shipping, the advancement of disease and parasites in the north. So it's really a system that's changing. If I'm looking outside, it says there's a really big bear.
There's
coming
been a
up
big
behind
bear,
there.
so we're gonna try to maybe get the.
He's gonna come up
camera
behind
over.
us here on the Tundra buggy.
Yeah,
So
let's see if we can get it.
so it's pretty neat being out here and seeing these big bears and what's going on with them. And this guy's sneaking around behind us. They love to come and check out
See if we can pop
our
him out
buggy.
on the other side.
Where is he?
Where's our
Well,
bear?
we've got another one behind the buggy, and this big guy's gonna walk towards him, I think. Out, yeah, straight back from buggy one, sorta. There's one a little closer to, there he is.
Oh, he's leaving us.
Okay, and then there's another one up there that he's gonna walk towards, I think. He came in from quite a distance, that guy.
That's a big male. You can
Yeah.
see just, I mean, they always see that weird characteristic swing in the hips, but big, I always think they look like they wear big furry bedroom slippers, the big males. And when you see their tracks out on the sea ice, you quite often see where the hair's been dragging in the track, so it's a classic characteristic of big males. That's a big bear.
Yeah.
I mean, he's probably been bigger. There's no question of that.
Out just a little bit and move up because he's walking right towards another one. And the other one doesn't know it. There he is. There we go. We might have an interaction here. We'll just.
Pull,
Yes, I will.
polar bear surprise going on here.
Yeah.
Oh, he sees him coming.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I
Isn't
think
too
he. Oh, maybe he
concerned?
doesn't. No, that's actually okay.
I don't know if this guy cares too much about the other one anyway, the one walking up, but
Yeah.
this is always pretty fun to watch out here. It's always different depending on the bears, what kind of comes out of it. If anything, maybe nothing. Oh.
It's
Not-
surprising. These bears are incredibly silent when they're moving. You don't really hear too much.
Wow. They're really not, oh.
Oh, hello there.
Just figured it out. Interesting. He's eating something, that one. I think it's just got some kelp or something.
I think it's probably a bit of kelp there.
Yeah. Oh.
A little bit of body language going on here. Lowered head is pretty standard greeting. These guys are pretty nice in match, and that's where you classically see some of the play behavior. I think some of this sniffing of each other we see right now, it's like, do I know you? And I think they probably do recognize each other. I mean, my dog can recognize other dogs. I mean,
Right.
there's no question that they can smell other dogs that they know. So we can only imagine that it's adaptive for bears to be able to recognize other bears in that context. And, you know, sometimes they do a lot of sniffing of each other's neck. It's sort of like, who have you been fighting with or play fighting with recently? But
pretty cool.
there's a lot of matching of what's going on.
Okay. And we see often, Andy, when they open their mouths at each other and kind of square off, are they testing each other's jaw size or breathing each other's breath? What is that
I
about?
don't really know, I mean, I think the guy in front here is maybe a little bit reluctant, but there sort of seems to be some protocol that you have to work through before you're going to do any play wrestling. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic to sort of watch these bears and figure out, are we going to wrestle or not?
Right.
I would say the big guy sitting down there, he's probably thinking this looks like a good wrestling place, but
Oh.
no, boring.
Too funny. Well, this is actually ties in well with another question that came in as we watch these guys. Are these sorts of behaviors and food sources much different in Churchill than they are in places, say, like Norway? Do you see this stuff in Norway?
Yeah, you do. You don't see it as often, partly because of the geography. So these bears end up being very concentrated here. There's a lot more places for the bears to be in Svalbard. There's a lot more coastline. When you look at, there's all these big fjords. This is a very simple ecosystem. Like there's a straight line east-west, and then it goes north-south, and there's very few bays and fjords. Where if you get into the Svalbard ecosystem, or even some of the islands up north, there's just so much more coastline for the bears to spread over. So you don't get the same concentration, but when the bears get together, they can wrestle just like these bears. They eat kelp just like these bears. They'll eat birds' eggs and anything else that washes up on shore. Polar bears are pretty much a polar bear the world over. They all seem to be just about the same. There's not much genetic variation in the bears as well, so there's a lot less variation in polar bears than there is in grizzly bears, for example. So it's kind of a polar bear is a polar bear is a polar bear. There's not really much variation in their size. They respond to the local conditions. If there's lots of food, they get really big. If there's not so much, they're a lot smaller.
And do you see these types of social behaviors? So this one, I don't know, they're kind of just laying down together right now, eating kelp. Would you see this in other areas, them kind of eating together in periods of low? Yeah?
Yeah, there's nothing to compete for here.
Yeah.
There's lots of kelp. They seem to like each other's company. It's kind of an interesting sort of phenomena, but there's places on the coast just south of us where you might get 10 or 15 bears like this, and they just lie side by each. And sometimes when we come in with the helicopters, if we're going to catch some of them, they'll actually coalesce. It looks like a rugby scrum, or a football team, and they just all get together and they all just stand there, and it's like, you're not the boss of me, go away, you're bugging me, and so it's like, it's pretty impressive. They adapt to their conditions, and right now there's nothing. There's no mates. There's no food, and so you change the rules. And if there was a dead whale here, and it was a big whale like a bowhead or even a large beluga, they'll share it. They don't try to sort of hog the whole thing.
Oh, that's pretty darn friendly behavior compared to maybe what a lot of people think of polar bears being like. So
yeah, these guys would not be like this in the springtime.
Right.
If there was a female, and I've seen this, where there's a female in breeding condition, then all of a sudden you end up, there's just blood everywhere, there's hair everywhere. I've seen bears with their, losing eyes and, broken jaws, broken limbs. It is really, really intense, especially when two bears of about the same size, and nobody's backing down. It can really basically be quite impressive to see just the fights. If they're unevenly matched, and I've seen those, the small one comes in and says, go away, big guy, and no way. He puts a licking on him, throws a couple of good blows, and the little guy just takes off and live to come back next year maybe.
And is that sort of sparring or playing behavior kind of related to the temperature? Because they're not going to do that if it's too warm out, or
no,
we wait till it's kind of cold?
Yeah, I think what we see is you never see the really skinny bears get involved in the sparring. It tends to be sort of the bears in average or better condition. They still have enough energy to dedicate to this type of activity. And if it's too warm, and Churchill can be pretty warm, we can easily get up into the 80 Fahrenheit or 30 centigrade, and warmer, and then the bears just do nothing. If anything, they'll sit on a beach ridge, especially the big males. They sit on a beach ridge, If they get too hot, they'll walk out into the ocean, but that's about it. They're pretty lazy bears at this time of the year. It's cooling down now, so they're getting starting to wander, and the migration towards the sea ice, if there was any sea ice, which there isn't, that's what they're really waiting for. So they keep coming out to the edge, and they're kind of testing to see if there's ice. There's no memo that goes out and says, "Oh, there's enough sea ice. Come on out, let's go." They have to find out for themselves.
Right. So we were kind of talking this morning, and yes, it is cold here, colder than what a lot of people in the world are used to, but for us, it really feels not too bad. We've been outside today without gloves. You can open the door handles without needing your mittens on. I'm not wearing a scarf today. I probably don't really even need this toque on. So a question that came in was, how much colder does it need to be for the bears to thrive again? It has gotten a little warmer here over the last several decades. How much warmer has it gotten, and can we get it back to what it was to allow the bears that sea ice habitat as what it used to be?
Well, I don't have at my fingertips the statistics, and so what we typically look at is ice duration. And one of the things we've lost here is how long this area is covered with ice, and that's really the dominant characteristic. So we're seeing the ice break up somewhere around 4 weeks earlier in the springtime, and forming anywhere from about 3 to 5 weeks later in the fall. So that's still within the zone of comfort for the bears. In a really bad year with an early breakup and a late freeze up, that's when we're starting to see mortality spiking a little bit. We're not sort of in the catastrophic era yet. It could happen. It could happen next year. It could be 10 years from now. It's clear that if we go forward in time towards mid-century, we're going to be into very challenging conditions. I don't think there will be bears here mid-century. In terms of getting it colder, most of the climate information I've seen is we've got a lot of warming locked in with our current levels of over 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we're not going to stop that immediately. We're not going to stop using fossil fuels, so we're probably going to see a rise for some years to come until hopefully the initiatives brought forward by COP21 and subsequent conventions basically change our way of living on this planet. And I'm quite optimistic that pushed to have to change, we will change. And I don't think we're going to notice it in our day-to-day life. I think we can easily do it with many of the technologies we currently have. It just really requires a commitment of changing our energy source. And we've done this before with international conventions. I mean, we've seen many pollutants decrease in time. When I was growing up, it was acid rain was the major threat, particularly in eastern US and Canada. And basically we've found the technology to deal with acid rain. Everybody forgets that we did with that. The ozone hole, we've fairly effectively dealt with the major threat to the ozone hole by international conventions, and carbon dioxide is just another pollutant that we have to control.
And Cassie, in that vein, what is your greatest hope for the COP21 talks? What are you hoping for the world coming out of Paris on the other end?
I am hoping to see real progress in the agreement that they're working on now, and a real realization, particularly on the long-term goal. Right now, one of the things that the negotiators are arguing over is whether the commitment to fully decarbonize the economy by 2050 will stay in the negotiating text. So that would mean committing to fully transform to renewable energy by the middle of this century, and we need that to stay in there and to get into the agreements going forward. So that's one real concrete thing that I'm watching in the negotiations, but bigger picture, I'm most excited about this sense of engagement and urgency that we're seeing around the world to continue. I feel like there's a real sense of inevitability about the switch to a clean energy future, about the big changes that we need to make to solve this problem that are also going to make the world a healthier, safer, more equitable place for everybody. There are so many advantages to switching over to clean energy. It's going to reduce the air pollution that makes people sick. It's going to create jobs. It's going to make transportation more effective and affordable for people. Really good things. And so I think it's going to continue, and I couldn't be more excited.
It is very exciting. And so please continue joining us this week through Polar Bear Week. And also please, do some research if you're interested on COP21 and how you can get involved. You can start at our website, polarbearsinternational.org. You can also visit our iTunes U channel for some other resources on polar bears for teachers and students. And thank you so much for watching on the explore.org cams. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Frontiers North Adventures, who donate Buggy One to us so that we can do these broadcasts and watch these polar bears. They've just been kind of going to town on this kelp for a few minutes, and I assume they will for a little while longer, so we'll go out back and watch them. Also, thank you to Parks Canada for helping us with those Cape cams out at Cape Churchill, and also the Churchill Northern Study Center with that really incredible Northern Lights cam that has also been picking up our little friend, the Gyrfalcon, who's around here, who we've really been enjoying watching. So please, everyone, if you want, sign the petition for carbon tax. Follow hashtag SaveOurSeaIce and hashtag Earth to Paris on Twitter if you're on Twitter. Join us on Facebook and just get involved any way you can. Any way that you feel you're comfortable in lowering your greenhouse gas emissions or supporting leadership and politicians that share those values, please go for it. We're all in this together, from Paris to Churchill, and for people and for polar bears. So thank you very much, and we will be chatting with you tomorrow. See you then. Hi, everybody who's joining us. We are live from Buggy One. I'm Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International. I'm a staff scientist and the Director of Conservation Outreach. And joining me is...
I'm BJ Kirchhofer, and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International and the Captain of Buggy One today.
Awesome. Well, thanks for bearing with us as usual as we get these cameras up and running. It's always, there's always something that comes up, but we're glad that you're here with us now and that we're live. We have a polar bear just outside our window, just to our left here. We were trying to get this internal cam on it, but the window's just not quite aligned. But if he moves, we promise that we'll get an eye on him. He's the same one that you guys have been seeing on the Tundra Buggy cam. So he's a big male. A little thin, but looking not too bad, and he's just pretty lazy today, hanging out, isn't trying to stay away from the buggies. He's been around the lodge and us for a lot of the day, so it's pretty fun watching him. We'll see if he does anything.
We could maybe back the buggy up, Lisa, if we want to do that quick.
Cool.
Get him on the cam. Should we try that out?
Sure. Yeah, if you guys want to come for a ride.
Yeah, let's just move the camera here.
See how this works.
And this is kind of how it works out here. Buggy One is totally mobile, and we have a wireless link that will take and send the video signal from here to the lodge and back into town and then out into the internet so you guys can see. So when we have bears around, then we pan the camera and focus on them. But when the bears move, which is pretty often, then we pick up and we motor down the road and try to find another polar bear. So why don't we show what we do?
Cool. You guys can see how this works.
Pretty short trip, Elisa.
Our few feet across the tundra.
We're just going to fire up here.
It's a little bit loud inside.
Hold on tight, everybody.
Sometimes we really do have to hold on really tight. There's a few big bumps out here.
You can see we're just really flying.
Yeah, what's the top speed on this bad boy?
No, I think if we were going 25 miles an hour, we'd be going really fast.
I can't even imagine going 25 miles an hour in this thing. Oh my gosh. Sorry, it's a she. You're right. Buggy One, I guess, is a she. Neutral. Gender neutral buggy.
Okay, so now we
Cool.
can try to find.
All right, let's see if we can see this guy.
Camera. We're just bumping that over.
I'll just scroll around. This is what our cam ops do all day. They operate the cams trying to look for polar bears.
You know, there's a bit of delay on it for some reason.
Interesting. It's never quite as easy as it seems it should be right off the bat. But out there you guys can see Hudson Bay, the Tundra, the
Some
flats
tidal
there.
flats right there.
Yeah.
A lot of this area right here has a lot of mud flats. I'm sure you've seen. Once the ice comes in, then all those little tidal flats will be just covered in snow and ice. I don't know if you can hear the radio calls there in the background. The buggy drivers up here all have a pretty good sense of humor. And everything has a code. So the code that just came in was Joanne Pants Off. And basically, a Joanne is an Arctic fox. And No Pants Lake is a place here. Uh-oh, I'm not sure we backed up far enough, Elisa. That's kind of embarrassing. I've been doing this for a while, too. I thought for sure we'd see that bear.
This is your 9th year driving buggy one, you're saying?
Yep, but I got another trick up my sleeve.
All right, we're going to see what BJ can come up with right now. He's pretty handy out here. Oh, we're going to move the cam. So this buggy one cam can move up and down. And then we can also swivel it. So it gives us a few different options for views. And so BJ's going to play with that and see if we can't readjust. Oh, there it goes.
Nice and low. Is this test? Okay. Guess we got the audio back maybe. Jonathan, we'll just keep talking here. We're getting levels on our end. It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure what happened there. Anyways, back we are, Elisa and I, on Buggy 1. And we're looking for that polar bear.
Yeah.
This is just kind of just a small example of how the polar bear the polar bear cam works here. Just a behind the scenes of our adventures here.
Yeah, we're just going to check that. Getting good messages. Our audio's good now.
Yeah.
Cool.
Looks like it.
So we just finished having lunch. I'm sure that the viewers can see that we have a few people in the background here, and we'll bring you around and introduce you to everyone. Buggy lunches out here are made for us by the Tundra Buggy Lodge, owned by Frontiers North Adventures, and we are oh so grateful that they provide us with hot soup and sandwiches and all sorts of good snacks. One of the things that's pretty fun to do out here, we have a big stove heater in the background. You guys can't quite see it. It's just behind us here. It keeps us warm. And if we wrap our sandwiches in tinfoil, we can kind of have a melted tundra sandwich, so that kind of helps keep the chill away on cold days. But today's actually not very cold. It's pretty nice out there. Not windy at all, which is kind of nice. Pretty rare for this time of year. It often gets pretty darn windy. So how about we go around and let's talk to the people we have here. BJ, is there anything you want to say more about Buggy One before we start chatting to our guests?
I don't think so. I think we can answer questions along the way if people want to chat them in or however that works. But maybe we can do a tour here.
Sure, yeah, we'll give you guys a little tour. I've been teasing BJ that he's a total hoarder, so I'll show you some of the stuff he has laying around up there. Yeah, so unfortunately, our lovely KT Miller with PBI is not here. She's a great set stylist. She always makes sure we're all cleaned up and the buggy's looking awesome when we do live chats, but she's not on Buggy One today, so it's a little bit, we tried to clean up though. It's looking pretty good. It's just a lot of people in here, so it gets a little bit crowded. Okay, you guys ready? Okay, I'm gonna move over here. Hello. All right. So everybody, well, I'll let them introduce themselves. How about? So this is our moderator for this week on Tundra Connections, which is our educational programming.
My name is Jennifer, and speaking of high winds, I came from Arviat Nunavut last week, and it took almost an extra day to get here because of the winds. So they're not kidding when they say that the winds can get pretty strong.
Pretty darn cool. So Jennifer, can you talk to us a little bit about what you do in Arviat and the organization that you founded and run now?
Yeah. Well, the trip last week was my second time up in Arviat Nunavut, and the organization that I started 15 years ago when I was 19 is called Taking It Global. And our whole mission is empowering youth to understand and act on global challenges. And we believe in the power of leveraging people and communities and technology to come together and create the world that we want to see. So it's really exciting to be here this week. It's our third year partnering with Polar Bears International, actually, but my first time out on the buggy. And we work on really exciting projects. Actually, one thing we just finished, just as we were setting up for this time with you, is something called Global Encounters, where we talk to students from classrooms in Peru, Ghana, the United States, and in Canada, in Edmonton. And we're working on a whole project. It's called Decarbonize, involving youth voices, understanding climate change and the impacts of climate change, and giving input on the climate change negotiations coming up in Paris. So we like to give youth voice at the local level, and we do a lot of arts-based work, and then also linking to international perspectives and UN processes and policymakers. And I'm talking here to my new friend, Jack. We just met this week, and he's talking to me about the walrus. We're looking at the walrus here.
So I asked all our panelists to check out other explore.org cameras. So, of course, we have the 5 polar bear cams around here, the Tundra Buggy 1 cam, the 2 Cape cams, and the 2 Lodge cams. And so I asked everyone to take a look at Explore's other cams and choose their favorite. And I got to tell you, the walrus cam is a pretty big hit. It's one of my favorites.
The screen is frozen.
You might have to hit refresh. Sometimes we have some bandwidth.
Make that.
Well, it's a good time to introduce you to our next panelist, Jack. Jack, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Yes, I'm token minority, and no, actually, my name is Jack. I'm from Northern Alaska, born and raised. Work in domestic international policy development. But they let me know that we can sort of take a different approach to this webcast or whatever it is, so I can be a little candid. Anyways, nice to have you with us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jack. Yeah, so we've been doing slightly more formal webcast this week, but we really love our Explore audience and being able to, just kind of chat about what comes to mind and hear about what you guys want to hear about. And so one thing that I know you guys were talking a little bit about is how important the walrus is in subsistence hunting in some northern communities and the conservation around walruses and keeping them in the Arctic. Is there anything you want to speak to about that or your experience with anything like that?
Well, I think it'd be best if we see if we have any interest from our audience, if they want to hear about it first.
Sure. So if you...
They may want to go through a couple more repetitions of backing up and going forward in the buggy.
You guys, you let us know. Let us know. Do you want us to drive around in buggy one a bit more? Do you want to talk to Jack about walruses? Just send us your questions, and we will do as asked. So we're going to come back to you guys. I'm going to introduce you to the next couple panelists. So in the corner, we have Jarrett. Jarrett, can you let us know a bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Jarrett. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Youth Arctic Coalition, so I work with young people who live in all 8 of the Arctic states. I'm also a full-time student at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I study political science and public admin. Between those 2 things, that's just about all I do. So,
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jarrett. And what camera? Jarrett is watching the kitten cam?
I am watching the kitty cam. I miss my kitties at home, so I was flipping through them and I saw this one and had to stick with it.
Awesome. Well, that kitten cam is pretty darn cute. So Jarrett's really one of our youth voices this week, speaking on behalf of youth, and he's actually off to Finland next week to do more cool stuff, so he's quite the traveler. And then over here, some of you may have met Dr. Jen Kay just a couple days ago when we pulled her into our first live chat of the season. Dr. Jen, can you reintroduce yourself for those that may have missed it?
Yeah, so hello, I'm Jen Kay. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, and I am really enjoying myself this week. It's quite a change of pace from being on campus and teaching the undergrads and doing research, just enjoying the bears. And, well, I guess right now I'm enjoying bears both outside my window, polar bears, and then bears in Katmai National Park on one of the explore.org cams. So I'm getting my bear fix today.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Jen. I know when Jen first pulled up the brown bear camos in the back, and we just heard kind of giggles and laughter, and I guess the mom was playing with their cub, and so that's been very enthralling, as of course the brown bear cams always are. I saw one question earlier before we started the live chat. It was if this polar bear has a name out here. I know that in Katmai, it's easier to identify the brown bears, and so a lot of the bears kind of have names that people know them as, and you're able to see these interactions. This area is very different in the way that it's really a migration. So the bears are moving through here. It's a short period of time, and a lot of them don't have enough distinctive characteristics for us to really either get to know them or name them. So we don't really do that. One of the ways we do follow who they are is that scientists who do mark recapture programs will mark each bear they capture with a specific number, and then they can refer to that number again and again and just identify the bear that way. So if you would like to call this bear something to yourself, that's awesome. Go for it. But right now, he doesn't have a name to us. He's just going to be our lodge bear for now. So, all right, I'm going to check if we have any questions coming in yet. I don't see any yet. Might be because we started really late. Okay, does anyone want to talk about your experience being up here? Or who wants to chat? No? Anyone?
Well, I can talk.
Jenna is great at talking.
You know.
Yeah, you are. You're here. I'm gonna pull up a chair.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Tell me about Arviat.
Yeah. Well, no, what I was going to say was that I had never, I mean, I guess I had seen a polar bear once in a zoo, which is very different. Maybe I can even ask you some questions of my own experiences. But well, last week on the day that my flight was delayed, so I was actually supposed to be here, but I was still in Arviat, and we went out for a drive. I had a really close view of a mama polar bear, and her two baby cubs, and it was beautiful to see them. The one thing that made me sad was that they were near the garbage, and they seemed kind of hungry, and so they were walking up to the garbage, and then they saw a few of us watching. I think there might have been. Maybe there was like someone who works on polar bear alerts up there. And then the mama bear looked at us, and we looked at the bear, and then she went back. So I was just curious if you could tell me anything more about that, polar bear encounters with people or with garbage. Yeah.
Well, I can talk a bit about it, and then Jack might want to chime in too with his experience. I know that back, 15, 20 years ago, there was also an open dump in Churchill, and it was a major bear attractant, and that's why a lot of bears came into town. There's a lot of human-bear conflict, and they simply, they're on land in the summer. They don't have a lot of food sources, and they've got great noses, and they're going to smell out where the good smell and stuff is for a polar bear. So that's since been closed up in Churchill. And that event, along with the Polar Bear Alert Program really taking off here, which is a system that Manitoba Conservation uses to help keep the polar bears out of town and away from humans, which is better for bears and humans, has really cut down on the number of conflict issues. But, Churchill is such a place where, compared to other places in the north, there are a lot of resources here, and it's a lot more accessible than a lot of areas in the far north. And so there are areas that are struggling with this human-bear conflict or even other wildlife issues. And so we're actually, there are some efforts right now to help Arviat in whatever way is best that they want to be helped, whether that's monetary or human resources or whatever, but just to help them out with that human bear conflict stuff, because they are seeing a lot more bears in their community. It's not safe for the kids, it's not great for the people, and it's not great for the bears, and we don't want that to become a terrible issue. We don't want anything bad happening up there. So
one thing I found out is that they had to cancel Halloween last year, so kids couldn't go out to trick or treat. And but what they did to accommodate, because they were worried to have people running around with candies, and I know that bears have an incredible sense of smell, so to not be attracted to the candy, they actually have a big party in the hall there. So Halloween's indoors. But it was a good first encounter. The other thing I noticed at the airport was not having food out in general, and just because their sense of smell is so strong. Right. Yeah.
Interesting. Jack, do you have anything to add on human-bear conflict?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, as we mentioned earlier, that others here are looking on web pages with live feeds. I was on Indigenous Natives of the North, and they didn't think it was a good idea if I show that, but that's the page that interests me when it comes to live cams. So when we're talking about deterrence, and so Churchill is renowned for its deterrence, diversionary feeding, human-bear interaction. As I said earlier, one of the things that the agency that I oversee is tasked with is developing deterrent strategies, diversionary feeding for the U.S. polar bear populations, of which there is only 2. So if you think about it, what's different, what I've been learning here in Churchill is you almost get patterns of not just migration, but a congregation of a significant amount of polar bears within a concentrated area. That's not necessarily the case in Alaska. So there are a few cases, places such as Kaktovik, which is near the northeast border between the U.S. and Canada. They have a congregation there of polar bears, and it's in due to the fact of whale hunting up there is where they dispose the carcasses and bones of the whales, so you get a concentration of polar bears. That and maybe Barrow, but through the other sort of coastal villages in Alaska, we haven't experienced the high concentration or high interaction rates between polar bears and humans such as they do here in Churchill. So our partnership with PBI thought it would be a good experience for me to come and see how Churchill deals with that. And so, you know, in the coastal villages that I represent, which there are 15, it's sporadic interaction between when polar bears show up in the villages. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so one of the things that we're looking to develop is not just a broad or blanket-wide sort of deterrence response for the villages, because our villages are unique in so many ways, but we're looking to develop local village response plans, and we have partnerships with other conservation groups. The World Wildlife Fund and the Nanick Commission just developed our first pilot project for one of our villages to develop this deterrence plan. And rather than sort of take a top-down approach, we started at the local level, fielding their concerns, how they deal with bears in general now and what would work best for them. So I'm really here to see what a top-notch, first-class, and long-established deterrence polar bear-human interaction program is like.
Well, thanks for that, Jack, and we're glad you're here. And Churchill is getting ready for Halloween this weekend, and there will be quite a few bodies out there lining the town and making sure that Halloween does not get canceled for the kids. But, of course, the program is running all year, not just on Halloween. So I'm sure it'll be a great year. I think we are going to answer a couple questions now. One is pretty funny. So there is a restaurant in town called Gypsies, and it is pretty well known as the place to be, is what it says on their sign, and they have got wonderful food and pastries and drinks. So the question is, what's your favorite thing to order at Gypsies? I gotta say, their apple fritters are amazing. We'll have to take you. You guys have ate at Gypsies the other night. Yeah, so if anyone ever comes here, or for you non-Canadians, try a Nanaimo bar. And maybe not all of you have heard of it. As a Canadian, I was shocked when I met people that didn't know what a Nanaimo bar was. It's just, I grew up eating them. So it's a dessert bar. So if you're ever up here, try one of their Nanaimo bars too. And yeah, poutine, I guess, if you come to Canada in general. So we have another question about Arctic foxes. Now, I'm definitely not an expert on Arctic foxes, but I know a couple things about them. So the question is there a large population of Arctic fox, and do they interact with the bears? Do bears eat Arctic fox? So Arctic foxes are one of those animals that do seem to go through cycles of high abundance and then low abundance. This year, from what I'm hearing and what people are seeing, it looks like it's a lower abundance year. A lot of this is tied to the small mammal population. So small mammals also fluctuate. So this could be deer, mice, voles, things like that. And if those are low, then the Arctic fox doesn't have a ton to eat, so they're going to be low. But another issue with the Arctic fox is competition from the red fox. We are seeing more red foxes move into this area, and that is because of kind of the shifting climate regime up here. And red foxes will outcompete Arctic foxes. Red foxes are bigger. They can push the Arctic foxes out of their dens, and they can even predate them. So it is not a great situation for Arctic foxes, but we are seeing them out here this year. They are around. probably having a good time. And something cool about Arctic foxes is that we do see them following polar bears around out on the sea ice. So they are scavengers too, and they will eat the polar bear leftovers that are out there. I don't.
I thought you said you didn't know much about it.
Oh, I know. I know there's a heck of a lot I don't know about Arctic fox, but I know those few little things.
I have something that might be funny.
Okay, let's do it.
I was getting ready to come up north, and I'm from Toronto, I should say. And I heard, I know, please love Toronto. Come on. So I was trying to figure out, I heard that they have bear spray up here, to protect yourself, just in case you have an encounter with a bear. And so I went to Canadian Tire and I asked if they had bear spray, and they pointed to a shelf, and this was the little spray that I got, which everyone laughs at me for. But I think it might work for a fox or coyote.
Okay. I don't think Arctic fox is gonna go after you unless it's maybe rabid. But that's good, just to know you have that. I'm glad I'm aware of that now.
No bear spray, though.
No bear spray. Okay, well, we've got bear spray for you here just in case. We've never had to use it. And as for if bears eat Arctic fox, I'm sure, if there was an edible Arctic fox or one, they would, but I definitely don't think that's the top choice for polar bears. Jack, do you know anything about Arctic fox that you want to say? No. Yeah, I'm with you. So I'm going to have to go do more research on Arctic foxes, you guys. Okay, so this is an interesting question and the answer is basically going to be I don't know. But it says approximately how many polar bears are left and how do we come to that number? Very interesting question. We have a very rough idea of how many polar bears are in the world. The estimate right now is 20 to 25,000, but we are reworking that estimate, and maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little bit more. And how do we come to that number? Well, shoot, it's pretty darn hard. Studying polar bears, they're just really spread out over one of the most harsh regions in the world. It's very expensive to get to them. It's very hard to even really understand what's going on in a subpopulation, let alone the worldwide population. Now, we have 19 subpopulations around the world. Some have a lot more data or information than others do. And so we really were missing gaps of data for a lot of groups of polar bears. We know that back in the 60s or 70s, the population was very decreased as a whole due to some overharvesting once people had snowmobiles and high-powered rifles and all this sort of thing. There weren't really any controls over who was coming up to get a polar bear, but that changed in the 70s where people got together and agreed to manage and conserve the polar bears. And with a lot of great management, the polar bear population numbers did come back to basically what we think was around normal. And now we know that in the future, and right now the issue is really climate change and not harvest. But we really don't have a great idea for how many numbers there are. And we know there's more in some populations than others, and it depends on the sea ice conditions in the area, the resources they have in the area. All those 19 different populations have, different pressures on them, different types of situations that they're dealing with. And it's just a really difficult question that a lot of scientists would love to know the answer to. Maybe one day. Did you want to add?
Yeah. So one of the tough things, at least in the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, I'm involved in management of the 2 U.S. populations. With that is a lot of domestic and international policy involved in the treaty between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Canada in regards to polar bears. So there are probably a few resource managers online with us today, and population estimates should absolutely found resource management strategies. And as was mentioned earlier, because of the range, habitat, difficulty of access, it amounts to immense costs for getting better metrics or understandings of the population's health of the 19 different subpopulations, which is absolutely key. In regards to the Chukchi polar bear population, we are at a very, very conservative estimate of around 2,000. That's what management decisions are being based on. And that data comes from the Russian side in a protected reserve called Wrangel Island. And the way that was arrived at was they observed a number of dens on Wrangel Island, and then sort of extrapolated out that the number of denning females, litter size, survival of litters would equal X number population of bears. That was 20 years ago, so there are great strides being made in assessing those population estimates through remote control vehicles, infrared sensing, and those types of things. So.
And I think that's a great point you ended on too, is the technology really helping us. And that's part of what we're doing in the second week of November, is a kind of STEM week where we talk about how technology is really the future of a lot of stuff. It's going to help inform a lot of our decisions, especially with polar bears and other wildlife management. The better tools that we have, the more we can understand and the better we can manage different things. And we'd really love any kids out there, young people, or any adults to, you know, if you're technology minded or you like that sort of thing, we really need new innovators and new ideas, especially for polar bears. Help us count polar bears, help us track polar bears. Right now we have a lot of trouble tracking male polar bears. Maybe one of you will be the person that fixes that problem for us. So there's lots of opportunities out there in the technological arena. So there is a question about, actually, Jen, I'm going to ask you this question. So, Jen K, I'm going to back up.
We had a little bit of confusion.
Yeah, sorry. We have two Jens. And then we've got Jen, Jack, and Jarrett. So we've got the MBJ. So I'm the only non-J person on this buggy. But we have a question that's talking a little bit. I'd like you to talk a bit about the difference between weather and climate. Someone's asking, so they've been watching the polar bear cameras for years, and every year the winter seems to arrive sooner with colder weather more rapidly approaching. They were wondering if you could explain the connection between polar bears and climate. And then I'm asking if you can, kind of the big picture of what climate is and what we are seeing shift. And
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important to know what climate is before you talk about how it's going to change, right? So the way I like to describe the difference between weather and climate is weather is like when you get up in the morning and you go outside and you see what's going on. Maybe it's raining, maybe it's hot that day, maybe it's, you need a snowsuit. But climate is what you expect to find out that door. So in the winter, you expect that you're probably going to need your coat most days. And in the summer, maybe you can go out in your bikini. I don't know. It depends on where you live, what the situation is, but it's what you expect. And it's often defined as, the statistics of weather. So you're averaging over multiple weather days, weather events, weather years to get a sense for things. So when we talk about climate changing, we can think about that as basically being your expectations changing, right? You expect that, winter is going to be warmer than it used to be because we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What actually happens that particular winter, of course, will be influenced both by the climate, what you expect, and the weather, what you get, So it could be exceptionally cold. We still have record lows, even in a climate system that's warming. So, I don't know if that helps a little bit. Yeah.
Totally. That's great. Thanks, Jen. Mm-hmm. And just, and the reason why polar bears kind of get lumped into this climate change talk is because of their link to the sea ice. And sea ice is very measurable. So it's very observable by satellites and data that we've been going back for a long time. And it's very, very clear that sea ice is declining. And the sea ice is habitat for many creatures, animals, even humans, but of course the polar bear as well. And so polar bears have kind of become this icon of climate change, which some could debate on, but that's kind of how it's become in the last few years. And they're such an interesting animal and a habitat debate. So if there's a gorilla that's endangered, we could protect the mountain that it's living on. We could put up a border. We could plant more trees. We could put maybe patrols around. But with sea ice, there's really no kind of retroactive thing that will help it stay or get it back fast enough. We really need to be more proactive with this thing and with keeping polar bears around, but also the ice seals that are up there, the walruses, the polar cod, all the creatures that live in the sea ice. We really want to keep sea ice around. And simply like Jen was saying, it's getting warmer and ice melts when it's warm. It's just pretty basic physics that I think we learn when we're kids, you know. So that's why we're out here. We are working on the polar bear, but the bigger message is let's just be better stewards of the earth and conserve sea ice, because sea ice really impacts the world in a lot of different really neat ways. That's kind of getting more into like global maybe climate patterns, but it's a pretty cool environment. And there's a lot of people that depend on the sea ice as well in the north to keep their way of life the same. And so we want to make sure that we all work together to do that. We have a question about snowy owls, which again, is anyone here a snowy owl expert? No. All right. I'm going to answer a couple things, a few things I know about snowy owls. So the question is, and then we can maybe connect someone with we do know a snowy owl expert. It's just not me. So can you tell us more about the snowy owl? Do they live solitary lives, or do owls live in pairs that mate for life? And what do the owls eat? I'm going to tell you the limited amount I know from being out here. So there have been snowy owls out here for the last few years, and we have been seeing male and females at the same time. I'm honestly not sure if they're a pair. We kind of assume they are, but they might not be. And they are hunting mostly the small mammals out here. I would think maybe occasionally they might get a ptarmigan. So we've got these little ptarmigans out here. They're like the tundra chicken. But I think usually they're hunting the smaller mammal type things. So again, the mice and voles and stuff like that. We see them kind of perched on rocks around the tundra. And they're pretty... I don't know, they're beautiful animals. The females are larger than the males. And I think the female we saw this year was more white than the male, who had a little more brown, but also white in general. So if we can find out more about snowy owls, or maybe even at one point, maybe not this year, but in the future, set up an expert chat or something, that would be pretty cool. Okay, so question for BJ. Coming back to BJ. I like this like reporting from Buggy One. It's pretty funny. I need a chair on wheels and maybe like a lapel mic so I don't have to drag this microphone around. Okay, BJ, can you describe the role of tundra buggies? Are they for staff, tourists, or both?
Yeah, mostly these things are for tourists. You can kind of see over our shoulder there. Where is it? Right there. There's a tundra buggy, and that's a full tour. Oh yeah. Some of them are pretty quiet. I think it depends on the driver. They have seats for 40, and people come from all over the world to load up on the tundra buggies. They fly all the way here to Churchill. They stay in the hotels, and they come out either for day tours or multiple day tours here on the tundra buggy. For the folks that want to stay overnight, there's a lodge here that we all stay at overnight. It's the Tundra Buggy Lodge. And it's really more like a space station than anything else. Because once we get off the ground in town, which is about an hour and a half drive from here, you don't get on the ground again. You load and unload from the back deck right into the lodge there. You walk up and down it like a train car. There's bunks in there. There's bathrooms in there. There's showers. There's a place to eat. There's even a lounge to kind of kick back and relax and watch the bears outside. So it's a pretty neat place, but there's no getting on the ground. There's a few staff buggies as well. You probably heard them, and you probably see them on the cams every once in a while. Everything on the lodge itself has to be brought out and brought back. So that includes all the food. So there's one that brings food out and back. There's one that brings luggage out and back. There's one that brings water out and back, and that one's just kind of sitting over here. We'll try to get a cam on it later. They pump water, filter, and UV filter it, and then pump it on the lodge for all the needs here. And then, of course, all the human waste gets hauled back to town on a different buggy. Yes, the poop truck. And so that's the tundra buggies.
Show them our fireplace?
I don't think we can. Yeah. You can. At the back of this buggy. So buggy 1 is different than the tourist buggies. The buggy 15 is the one that's behind us there. It has, like I said, seats for 40 in there. This one doesn't have any permanent seats in it. You can see we're just scooting around on folding chairs.
It's a bit dangerous over those big humps if we haven't warned people enough, because you can definitely topple over in here.
If my foot gets a little heavy, I can really toss everybody in the buggy here right onto the floor. But yeah, so this is an open space, so we can use it as our broadcast studio for stuff like this and for the Tundra Connections program that we do for Polar Bears International. On the back of the buggy, you can't really see it, and unfortunately the camera's mounted, so we can't move it, but there's there's beds back here, and there's a bathroom back behind us. So this is kind of a special little buggy just for Polar Bears International. It's Frontiers North Adventures that loans this to us for every season, which is really generous of them.
Yeah. Well, thanks, BJ. Oh, and we did talk about this in the first live chat, but I saw some people were interested in it and asking questions. Could you just really briefly talk about the road system here and why it's in place and how we follow it?
Yeah, totally. So Fort Churchill was a military base back in, I believe, I got to go back to the book, but I think it's like the 50s, maybe the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It closed in the 60s here in Churchill, Manitoba. And the military used to do exercises out here with different vehicles. And so they created the road system. The buggies stay to that same road system to make sure we don't tear up the tundra. If we were to drive off the road, the damage we would do to the muskeg and to the surroundings would last for well beyond any of our lifetimes. So we stay on the trail so we don't muck everything up. And that's who established it, the military.
Thank you. And part of the reason that it takes so long for the plant life around here to rebound is just such a harsh growing condition up here. There's not a lot of sunlight and only a couple months where it's really kind of warm and nice, and the plants aren't getting battered by the Arctic winds and snow, and it's not cloudy. So really not a lot of growing season up here. That's why we see the trees we do see, especially kind of anywhere near the coast, are pretty small. We'll see flag trees sometimes. So those are trees that only have branches on one half of their trunk, which is pretty cool. And you can tell the direction of the wind by looking at the flag trees. So those are kind of neat. But yeah, plants, and there's a crazy diversity of plants up here, considering there's lots of different berries and mosses and willows and bushes, but they're all pretty low to the ground, and only get to grow a little bit every year. So another question about, are polar bears considered a keystone species? They are the apex predator in their environment, and as such we do consider them a keystone species. One interesting thing we've seen in the last couple years in Hudson Bay is that with the ice breaking up differently, we have seen some orca whales come into the bay. Now, so far, this isn't, an indication of anything huge happening or any regime shifts, but if that continues to happen, it's possible there may be some competition at the top of the food chain there for polar bears and access to seals, but it really depends. There's a lot of factors there. So we're just kind of keeping our eye on it as something kind of interesting ecologically in the bay. And right now, there's not a whole lot else we can say about that. Is smell the strongest sense that polar bears rely on, and how do they compensate with the strong winds? Are they less active the stronger the winds? So polar bears have an excellent sense of smell. We believe they can smell a seal from maybe about 1 kilometer away on the sea ice. They can even smell seals under their snow layers. It really does depend on the winds, though. If the wind isn't in their favor, it's going to be hard for polar bears to smell out there. And I don't know, probably some polar bears smell better than other ones, too. So it kind of depends how on it they are. But yes, they have a very, very good sense of smell. Many bears do. And I don't know how they compensate with the strong winds. So there has been a bit of research looking at the stronger the winds, the more the ice breaks up, and the kind of different patterns that polar bears have to walk. But I'm not sure if I don't think it took into consideration their sense of smell, how that shifts with the wind. But maybe we'll know that one day. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. And then, are they less active the stronger the winds? We do see them hunker down here when the winds are going really fast. But of course, there's not really many seals to get right now. So they're probably way more willing to just kind of lay down with their back to the wind and go to sleep. Out on the sea ice, as far as I know, from what I've heard, when it gets super, super stormy and there's no real point for hunting, they definitely will lay down. But I would assume maybe if there's chances of getting seals, or they might not want to take a break. But that's something I can't really answer on behalf of polar bears. Might depend on the bear.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting question, huh?
Yeah, it is.
Because seals don't have to stop breathing.
Right.
Just because it's blowing, they still have to go to their breathing holes, and they still have to surface. So.
I have heard that when it's really stormy, seals will kind of go to sleep in the water, and they can float, so they can keep breathing with their heads above the water, but they kind of bob in the water, and that might be a good opportunity for a polar bear to go get a seal. So I've definitely heard that, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I don't know. There's so many mysteries out there on the sea ice that I'm not going to answer or pretend to answer, but it's pretty interesting. Ooh, and this is a cool question too. So how do sows emancipate their cubs after their 2.5 years together? Do they just chase them off? If there are twins, will the twins stay together for a certain amount of time, or does everyone go off on their own? So again, this isn't something we really have hard knowledge on, but we do believe, and from what we've kind of seen, is that sows, yeah, it may be kind of a chase-off sort of deal, or when the female goes into heat, a big male comes along, helps chase the cubs away. The mother just won't give them milk anymore, or that kind of affection. So I'm sure it's not a great kind of period in a polar bear's life when their mom kind of kicks them out, but most animals have to go through that. And we actually do think that if they're siblings, they might stay together for a little while. We have seen that. As for how long, I think it might completely depend, maybe even on gender, on their bond, on what happens to them circumstantially when they get booted away from mom. But we think that often happens. They'll stick together for a little while, and then I don't know. Couldn't tell you. Maybe one day we'll have more information on that. So let's just answer a couple more questions. I know we started a bit late, but we don't want to drag it on too much past 3 o'clock. How old is the oldest polar bear you are watching or studying? How long do they typically live for? So let me think about that. Well, we know that the oldest polar bear, do you want to talk a little bit about her? You know a lot about that.
Sure. The oldest polar bear, she was in captivity, or the oldest polar bear that we know about was in captivity here, or just south of here at the Winnipeg Zoo. And she lived to be 42 years old. Her name was Debbie. And the joke that I was told is that she had a really good health care plan down there. You know, she had a whole team of vets that whenever she had anything go wrong, they would take care of her. Of course, wild bears don't have that advantage. If something happens to them, they have to either figure it out themselves or they may not make it. So that's one big limiter there in the wild polar bear's life. But yeah.
Yeah. So wild polar bears definitely don't live as long as Debbie did. We know that females can live into their mid to late 20s. Maybe a few have gone a little bit past that. And male polar bears usually about mid-20s, early 20s. They have a bit of a tougher go just with all the kind of fighting for females and stuff. So sometimes they can get pretty beat up by the time they're in their 20s. Yeah, so I don't know how old the oldest one is that we're watching. I think we know of a female that's caller right now that's about, I think, 22. I might have to check on that, but we've definitely been following bears that are in their early 20s. Yeah. So this is, I'll have to look this up on our website. So someone is asking about polar bear vocalization and any indication as to how they communicate with one another. So I believe we do have a recording, or there is a recording somewhere of polar bear vocalizations. I believe it was captured in a zoo. They do vocalize to each other, mostly I think moms to cubs. They will kind of talk a little bit, and then I'm not sure if males, I think they could growl at each other. I'm not even going to go there. I don't really know. I'm going to look that up. There's a little bit of research.
I was working with Megan Owen, Dr. Megan Owen of San Diego, because people were looking at, or she was looking at polar bear vocalizations, and so I took some recording equipment down. I did at Nanook Lodge south of here on Cape Tatnam, pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and it was there was a female with cubs on a food source, and another female and cubs came in, and that's when they started vocalizing. So it seemed to be like a high stress. Females to each other. That's what it looked like. It looked like a high stress situation. It was pretty neat to capture, for sure. Yeah, but you almost never hear them vocalize around here. No.
Stress maybe, or
Yeah, there's just not a whole. I mean, there's nothing really going on, is there? They're just waiting for the sea ice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not going to tell each other they're sleeping today. But they do also communicate by scent, and Megan Owen also was involved in that study that showed that males will follow female polar bear prints across the sea ice because they can actually smell that the female is in heat through her smelly footprints. And so that is a type of communication that polar bears also do, which is pretty neat.
I was listening to one snort.
What's that?
I said I was listening to one snort at another one earlier today.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Then that was maybe two males. Well, I guess it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was surprised because I have a 3-year-old at home, and you ask questions. You know, what song does the dog make, or what song does the cat make? Okay, what sound does the bear make? And it's the growl. But I haven't heard a growl after all the bears we've seen, so it's true. I guess it must be really if there's something to fight for. But they just seem like really. I was asking this as well. Maybe this is a question for me to you, but do you think they get lonely, bears? I mean, they seem kind of solitary, like kind of on their own, especially the male bears.
I mean, I think in general they're live solitary lives, but I feel like some of them, we have seen them before kind of almost form pairs, and whether that's because they're related, we don't know, but kind of last year we had those two that were kind of buddies, and they were hanging around each other all season and causing trouble around here. So I think maybe some do like company more than others, and we do see the large groups of polar bears that seem to be totally fine hanging out with each other. Jack, do you know of any vocalizations in Kaktovik at all when all those bears are eating at the same pile?
No, I don't remember. I don't think I was paying attention, but I was this morning, and it wasn't through the nostrils. It was more, if anybody is into linguistics, more of a fricative, meaning passing air between the tongue and the cheeks. So, yeah.
That's pretty cool. Oh, what are you pointing at, Jen?
Bears walking our way.
Is that a different one?
You heard what your show was about,
Yeah.
so-
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're having a little cameo. Oh, BJ's getting him up. He's coming right towards us. Well, let's see if we can't get... This is a nice way to end our live chat for sure.
Look up from your computer, and there he is.
Whoa.
Be careful now, we don't wreck another camera.
Oh, yeah.
Right to it. Well,
BJ's moving the camera up, so the bear... Uh-oh. Oh, no. And that's exactly... Good timing, BJ.
Did we get to see him on the cam there?
I don't know. I think they did.
Yeah, hopefully you
Oh.
get to see some of that.
That's hilarious.
Cute little bear, huh?
Yeah, he's got ear tags, so that's a bear that has been handled before.
That's our buddy who's been around a few times.
Yeah.
Yeah, what else can you say about this?
Well, I think he is a youngish bear, and I say he, but I can't be 100% sure if it's a he or she. But it's definitely not one of the biggest ones out here. But looking pretty good. It's got a good amount of body fat for its size. Going underneath the buggy right now. It's gonna go peek out the other side.
we always have to do these checks when we go
Oh yeah.
driving.
Oh, okay. Oh, there he is. Cute. Yeah, so I guess this will be a pretty good time to wrap it up. So all our guests are staring out the window watching this bear, and we'll let you guys get back to bear watching or watching the other awesome Explore cams. I just want to thank you for joining us and for asking those great questions. We really like chatting with you guys and just kind of sharing a bit of our experience out here, and just thanks for hanging out with us on Buggy One today while we're finished with our educational stuff. And it's just great to have a really nice chat with our viewers. And we will have another live chat Friday morning, I think is our next one. But we'll have the cams running between then all through the weekend, and we're going to be keeping in touch. November 1st is the beginning of Polar Bear Week, which is exciting. So stay tuned for that. We're going to have lots of broadcasts, and we'll have some challenges through PBI and some fun stuff that you guys can do to get involved with polar bears. And then the week after that is our STEM week, where we will have some scientists up here that are really involved in using technology to study polar bears. So should be really, really great. Thanks for joining us. We're going to keep you updated on what's going on out here on the tundra with the polar bears, and we hope to see you soon. And thanks to all the panelists that I pulled into the live chat today. They were great. So bye. Hi, everybody. My name is Elisa McCall, and I'm with Polar Bears International. And we are broadcasting to you today live from Buggy One in Churchill, Manitoba. So this is BJ Kirschhofer. BJ, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm BJ Kirschhofer, and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International, and also part-time captain of Buggy One. Monday through Friday, I sit in this seat over here and drive the polar bear cam around, and on the weekends, KT Miller is the captain of Buggy One. Yeah.
Cool. Well, some of you, I think, joined us last year, so it's fantastic to have you back again. And some of you are probably new to this Tundra buggy cam, so maybe we can explain a little bit about what's going on here. First of all, we would love to thank explore.org for helping us do this. Explore.org, of course, provides just a ton of help getting these cameras up and running. They're a huge partner of ours. We couldn't do a lot of what we do without them. Also, Frontiers North Adventures. They are the owners of the Tundra Buggy and Tundra Buggy Lodge, and they donate Buggy One to us all through bear season so that we can do these educational outreach programs and talk to people all around the world from polar bear country. So that's pretty darn cool. And we'd also like to thank Parks Canada, who's been really instrumental in helping us set up our Cape cams, which we will also talk about, and maybe you will see. So with that, why are we here right now? Well, it's polar bear season because it's the polar bear migration coming through Churchill right now. We are on the coast of Hudson Bay at the moment, and Hudson Bay is a large body of water that's relatively shallow, and it completely freezes over in the winter and completely melts in the summer. And when it freezes over, there's sea ice, and polar bears love sea ice, and polar bears live all around the coast of Hudson Bay. And when there's sea ice, we can't see them. They're out there and they're hunting seals. They use sea ice mainly for hunting seals, also for traveling, mating, and some aspects of reproduction. Some polar bears den on the sea ice. But in Hudson Bay, they den on land because in the summer, the ice completely melts and we see polar bears come onto shore and just wait for the next round of seal hunting. And right now, they've been waiting since about July. And it's almost time for the bay to freeze up. We don't know when it will be, but it should be within the next 2 to 6 weeks. And the bears know this. Whether they know it because the light's changing or the temperature's changing, we're not too sure. And so they're lining up along the coast. So I got a message that they're only intermittently hearing us. Can we do anything about the audio? Okay, we're going to check the audio and maybe we'll do another quick intro. Thanks for bearing with us during our first live chat of the season, everybody. Okay, we're just going to keep talking. So let's talk a little bit about, well, how about we talk about the summer? So for anyone that was watching the cams in the summer, you maybe saw the Beluga cam, which is also live from Churchill, Manitoba. And that was with the very incredible Haley Shepard as the boat captain. And Haley's on one of her other jobs right now as a polar bear tour guide. And so she's out somewhere here right now, bringing groups of tourists around and talking about polar bears. And that she just has huge shoes to fill. She's an incredible guide. And so we'll do our best to kind of tell you guys about polar bears throughout the season and keep in touch. And then maybe if we can get Haley on here sometime this year, we'd love to do that. She's wonderful. And we've already seen her this year, and she's having a great time watching polar bears. So we do have one polar bear outside our buggy right now. This guy, likely a male, but hard to tell from such a distance. He's just been sleeping. He's pretty unperturbed by all of this. We have one other buggy watching him, and he's barely moved. So a lot of the bears that are around here right now, they are kind of they're in a fasting state. So we used to say that there was, or think that there was a state of walking hibernation. So polar bears don't hibernate like other bears, but we figured, well, maybe during the summer they lower their metabolic rate and kind of go into some sort of hibernation state. But we found out from some research that came out this year that they don't actually do that. So they're simply fasting. It's been quite a while since they've eaten a really solid meal. You may see some polar bears on the cam eating kelp. In the summer, some polar bears like to eat goose eggs, kind of anything they can find. Bears just love food. Bears like being fat. But these polar bears, they really need the fat from the seals. That's where they're getting their calories. They have huge bodies. Their digestive systems are really evolved to eat fat and not the amounts of carbohydrates and proteins that brown bears or even black bears would eat. So these bears are really looking for their first seal of the season, hopefully in the next month or two. So we're going to keep talking about stuff, but we'll sprinkle in some questions while we're doing this. Let's just start off with one for BJ. So we are in the middle of the Tundra right now, and we're on this little vehicle, and we're quite a ways from town. So we are remote broadcasting. How the heck are we doing this, BJ? And what are some challenges with making this happen?
We definitely have a lot of help from explore.org and some of their contractors to help bring the internet out here. But basically, we're using more or less amped up wireless Wi-Fi technology. It's directed in a single direction instead of in all directions like your hotspot at home. And that is able, with big antennas and tall towers, to be able to be blasted across the tundra to a moving vehicle like we have here. So it's a unique application for this type of technology. I think a lot of it's designed for sort of point-to-point communications, but to put it on a vehicle like this in an area like this is unique, like I say. So there's definitely a lot of challenges that come along with that. Because we are in the subarctic here outside Churchill, the weather is just nasty, especially this time of year. It's blowing, it's cold. There's a lot of stuff that makes it so these electronics don't really want to work. And it's uncomfortable for people to work too. So there's been a lot of challenges that we face. I mean, everything from ice building up on our antennas to having to go visit these sites to check on stuff when it's like 40 degrees below zero or colder. So, there's a challenge there that I find pretty fun.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you find it fun. It's not the thing I'm good at doing, but everyone just loves BJ out here because he's providing internet for just huge groups of people. We also, one place we work with out here is the Churchill Northern Study Center, and that's a big research center that's about half an hour outside town, not too far from where we are right now. And throughout the year, they host scientists to do research. They are hosting some learning vacations right now during bear season, and it's just the most incredible northern research facility. We kind of joke that when we're doing field work from Churchill, doing polar bear work or anything, it's really luxurious compared to doing research in other parts of the Arctic, because we're coming back to a great meal and warm rooms and really high-tech equipment and different sorts of stuff at the end of the day, which is pretty neat. And it's with their help that we can get some of this internet blasting out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. It's a good partnership. Like I said, internet out here requires tall towers, and the Churchill Northern Study Center was once a rocket research range, and so they would shoot rockets into the atmosphere to study the northern lights. Now they have built a LEED Gold certified building, and they can house researchers like Elisa and some of the other polar bear researchers, or people looking at permafrost or birds or just about anything out here, and help support their operations. So it's a really fascinating facility. Now, we use their tower, and in turn, we give them internet. Some of the things that they use it for is not only their guests and their staff to be able to communicate back home, but also they have some long-term contract researchers there, people looking at the northern lights, folks looking at lightning in the Arctic here, folks looking at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of neat stuff going on out there. And of course, all that stuff requires computers. So they're able to pipe into these computers through the internet, through the bandwidth that we help provide. And they can log this data over a long period of time and then grab it via the internet. They don't have to make a big trip up here to get that stuff. So yeah, it's a great partnership. We love working with the CNSC.
And maybe you can talk a bit about the Aurora Cam while you're...
Yeah, so we're really pretty pumped about this one, and I think Explorer is going to be really excited as well as the Explorer community. At the very top of this 180-foot tower, we helped install a camera that's real sensitive after dark, and it'll be able to point up into the night sky and stream the northern lights. Now this time of year, the northern lights are a little bit hit and miss. It's often cloudy until the bay freezes up. But once the ice forms out there on the bay, it's going to be a fantastic camera. I don't know if some of you maybe saw the stuff captured by the Cape Churchill cameras last year. The Auroras were pretty fantastic. Now this camera can point up, and it's well off the ground. It's going to be a really neat point of view.
Super cool.
So stay tuned for that.
Well, we're getting some questions about some polar bears rolling in here. So there's one question about, how do bears hunt on sea ice? Do they dive into the water? So there's a few different ways that bears hunt on sea ice. One of the best known and maybe one of the most common ways is called still hunting. And For seals, so the type of seals that polar bears are mainly going after are the ring seal, that's their main prey, but also bearded seal, and to a small extent around here, harbor seal. But let's talk about the ring seal. So ring seals, they kind of set up these home ranges out underneath the sea ice. And throughout the winter season, they're maintaining breathing holes. Because, of course, they're mammals, they need to breathe air. So they'll have a series of maybe 5 or 6 breathing holes that, of course, allow them to pop up and take a breath and then continue swimming underwater to find their fish. And polar bears have figured this out pretty well. And so if they're able to locate a seal breathing hole, they are very, very patient. And they will just sit very quietly, crouch down next to a seal hole for hours and hours on end. And as soon as a seal pops up, the polar bear is going to dive into that seal hole and using its massive teeth and claws, going to pull that seal up. And polar bears have really evolved. You can see the difference between brown bears and polar bears. Many of these adaptations are for this type, similar hunting of seals. So they've got, polar bears have a much kind of smoother, more sleek profile than grizzly bears. This is allowing them to get in and out of those seal holes. Their teeth, the back teeth, are much more for shearing and cutting meat and fat compared to the grizzly bear's back molars that are much more for grinding. And the polar bear claws are thick and sharply curved, and can also be used for attraction on sea ice, actually, whereas the brown bear claws are long, lightly curved, and more used for digging. Other types of polar bear hunting techniques, we think that, they can probably be sitting on the side of an ice floe or a lead. A lead is an area of open water within the sea ice, and be waiting for seals to come up and dive in. They can probably do some pretty stealthy hunting. There's videos online of a seal resting on sea ice. So seals will haul out to have a break from swimming. And if the polar bear is able to sneak up either from underwater and up or over the ice, that's maybe a good way to get a seal. Very rarely polar bears will be able to maybe get a seal more in open water, but this is going to be when the seal's pretty unaware, maybe sleeping, maybe still pretty close to ice, because if you have a race underwater between a seal and a polar bear, the seal's going to win every time. Polar bears are excellent swimmers, but they're much more, and they can actually dive as well, but seals are a lot more agile, a lot more easily able to dive and maneuver underwater more quickly than a polar bear. So polar bears really need that sea ice to do the majority of their hunting. So that's why sea ice is so important. And we had another question about what they're eating at this time of year. So we had talked about that a little bit, but I know we got cut off to some extent. So right now we do see polar bears eating kelp. We'll see them eat goose eggs or carcasses when they can, but it's really the calories from fat and that seal fat that they're waiting for. So while on land, polar bears are losing roughly 1 kilogram of fat a day. And many of them, that's okay. They come on to shore with a lot of fat resources, fat reserves that they're living off of. But it's the younger bears and the females that are trying to reproduce later on this year that will struggle with any sort of decrease in their hunting time. So for female polar bears, they are mating in the spring, but they have something that's called delayed implantation. And this is when they may have a fertilized egg after mating, but they're not technically pregnant because that fertilized egg is not implanting until around this time of year. And that's after her body's kind of assessing how much fat does she have and does she have enough to fulfill a pregnancy. And we know that the threshold for a pregnant female polar bear, it's going to be around 420 pounds or so. And if she's below that, her body just physically can't really do a pregnancy. And it's the same with every mammal, including humans. There's, once you're a low enough weight, you just can't produce a child. And so polar bears at this time of year, if they are pregnant, if they have enough fat, they're going to go into their dens and they're going to do a sort of hibernation until they give birth later this winter and then emerge with their cubs next spring. So pregnant females at this time, they haven't eaten since around July, and they're not going to eat again until about February or March. So they can go quite a while without food. It's a really long time without food. I don't like going a few hours without food, and these bears are able to last quite a while. So it is pretty darn incredible. And we have some questions about, maybe we've got a question about cubs, so I'll answer that right now in that same vein. So polar bears have between 1 and 3 cubs a year. Triplets used to be more common in this area. Now we're seeing a lot more single and twin cubs. And the gestation, so the time between the actual pregnancy realizing itself and giving birth, it's only really a few months. Polar bear cubs are born very, very small. They're only maybe a pound at birth. And the mother to baby ratio of bears, actually in general, bears have the smallest babies compared to their own body size of any placental mammal, which is pretty cool. So for humans, one of our babies might be 1/15 the size of the mother. For bears, it's maybe 1/500th, or in one case with the panda, 1/1100th. That's crazy. So this is good for bears because it allows them to give birth fairly easily, but then those cubs grow really fast, drinking really fatty, rich milk from their mom. So it's pretty darn neat. Let's see what else. So is there any info on current ice conditions and weather, and are things above average or below for this year? So I'm not sure if we have too much information at the moment. Scientific.
Come in and talk about that, couldn't we?
Do you want Jen to join us, or?
We should ask Jen. Maybe
All right,
step out for a
let's do
second,
it.
And we'll just have Jen talk.
Well, what a treat, ladies and gentlemen. So we have with us this week, part of what PBI does during this time of year is our Tundra Connections programming through our own website. And with that, we bring up experts from all around the world and different areas, and we talk to all different groups. And so we have some broadcasts planned this week. And one of the experts with us this week is Dr. Jen Kay from the University of Colorado, and she is a climate specialist, sea ice expert, all that good stuff. And so maybe we will have Dr. Jen tell us a little bit about what's going on with the sea ice and the climate this year.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Elisa. Hello, everyone. So let's see. September this year was actually the 4th lowest Arctic sea ice extent on record. So I guess if you have a question about how sea ice compares to like the recent past or the long-term climatology, well, the recent past, 4th lowest. We've had a couple of years before this that have had less sea ice, 2012 being one of them. But compared to the long-term average, like when satellites started measuring sea ice, we have, maybe 60% of what we used to have. That's Pan-Arctic, though. And here in Hudson Bay, I'm not as familiar with the specifics of what's going on here. But I know we've had increasing open water just about everywhere in the Arctic. So.
And while we have you here, there's a question about, will the El Nino have any effect on the sea ice? Do you know anything about that?
That's a good question. So El Nino, for those of you who aren't familiar, is basically when the tropical Pacific gets really warm. And this has impacts on the tropical atmosphere and ocean, but it actually has worldwide impacts. So when we have El Nino, we tend to have, for example, high global mean temperatures. It's one of the reasons 2015 might come out as the warmest year on record. The impacts on the Arctic will rely on something we call teleconnections. So that's how you basically connect the weather and the ocean conditions in the tropical regions with those in the Arctic. And those kinds of linkages do exist, but there's a lot of variability in the climate system. So it's a question of how strong they are. So I think there are some connections, but I don't think I would make my weather forecast based on them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can speak just a little bit to what happened during the breakup season this year. So every year in Hudson Bay, of course, there's a time when the ice freezes and a time when the ice breaks up and melts. And we know that the breakup season was a little bit interesting this year in this area. A wind event came through and it pushed a lot of the ice in the western Hudson Bay over to the east and south. And so overall in Hudson Bay, the ice concentration was roughly normal. But if you looked regionally, it was quite different. It was a lot heavier east and south and a lot lighter in the west. And so what we saw from some of our collared bears was that a lot of them chose to ride the ice down and continue hunting. And now a lot of them would have gotten off in the province of Ontario or maybe more southern Manitoba. And I'm sure a few of them made their way back up, but maybe not all of them did. It's quite the energy trade-off. Polar bears need to decide what's worth it. Of course, their body fat matters a lot to them, as we talked about. And so is it worth walking, or are they going to wait down there for the ice this year? So we'll have to wait and see what happens. So far, there are a few polar bears out here. And there's not a ton, but people have been seeing, I think one day a group saw 10 polar bears. There's been 8 polar bears. We've seen a couple today. It's a little bit windy today, and when it's a bit windy, they like to kind of hunker down. But it is getting colder, which is a great sign, and often when it's colder, we see more activity. And one of those activities we see is sparring. And we have a question about sparring. And it says, why do polar bears spar? Are they siblings? That's a great question. Maybe. They might be siblings. We think that a lot of times they're not necessarily siblings. It seems to be mostly the males, although there has been one case of people seeing a female spar up here, which in that one we were definitely wondering if she was sparring with her brother or something, because that's pretty rare. But usually it's a couple males, and we think it's largely kind of almost preparation for the mating season. They're kind of sizing each other up, figuring out their strengths, kind of having a good time too. Polar bears are pretty intelligent, and they like having things to do, and maybe it's a bit fun. Maybe they're learning what it's going to take to really go up against another male. One thing we do see at this time of the year, though, is if one of them gets tired or a little bit scratched or something, they usually back out of it pretty quick. It's really not worth fighting all out at this time of year because there's just no reason. So we'll see them do it a little bit for fun and then kind of back down and go their own ways. However, in the spring, when they're actually fighting over females, things get pretty ugly. So they can inflict some pretty serious damage on each other, trying to get the lady who's ready to mate. And yeah, so they get a little bit of practice in at this time of the year. And of course, it's pretty amazing to watch. It's pretty cool. So maybe we'll see some of that this year. If we do, we will be very sure to show everyone on the Explore cams because it's lots of fun. All right, let's see what else we have. Oh, there's a question about why are there fewer triplets these days. So we do believe that is linked to the sea ice. Even when there were triplets kind of, 30, 20 years ago, there's usually very clearly a runt out of the triplets. There's one that's a lot smaller and it would be harder for that bear just to make it past, up higher to the ages. And there's competition among cubs to get their mother's milk. And we would see the runts kind of be pretty scratched up and all that. So not to say some of them couldn't make it to adulthood. I'm sure some did. But these days, I just think it's harder for females to produce 3 cubs and raise them all, so it's almost like a waste of resources to have 3 cubs. There's just not enough of the nutrition out here to really support that anymore, and that's why we think we're seeing a lot fewer triplets in this area. Absolutely. So another question: are the numbers of polar bears that are seen still good and not diminishing? Are they looking fed and happy? Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one thing to keep in mind, we're talking to you this year from Churchill, and we are in the middle of the western Hudson Bay polar bear population. But there are 18 other polar bear populations around the world in 5 different countries. And so a lot of these polar bears have kind of different situations. They're going to be experiencing changes in the climate at different rates in different ways. They might have slightly different prey sources or pressures on them. And so in this area, we do know that sea ice is changing. This is the best studied polar bear population in the world. Canada has 2/3 of the world's polar bear population, which is pretty cool. The United States has 2 populations and Canada has about 13. So that's pretty neat. And we have linked some changes in this population to climate change. So there was a period in about the late 90s, early 2000s where this population declined about 22%. Since then, we believe it has stabilized, as we would expect to see kind of dips and stabilizations as these bears adjust to shifts in their climate. And so right now, we think the population's right around between 900 to 1,000 bears. It's hard to know for sure. The ones we've seen this year, it's quite a mix. I've seen a couple pretty thin bears, but also quite a few that are looking fed and healthy. And so we'll just see what happens. There's what's happening here, it takes time, and we've got lots of time to make sure that these polar bears stay healthy and happy and that there's sea ice in Hudson Bay. And that's one of PBI's goals, is to keep polar bears in the Arctic always. And we do that by everyone's help, your help and the help of our partners, and just inspiring people to care about these beautiful animals, but also all the other Arctic animals that you guys are watching through the Explore cams and through other avenues. There's some pretty amazing wildlife out there. Some other wildlife we see out here often, at least often this year, there's quite a few snowy owls around here right now, which is pretty darn neat. So we're going to see if we can get some of those on cam at some point this season. There's been 1 or 2 Arctic foxes roaming around. It's actually kind of a low year for the foxes, but they're out here, so we'll keep an eye out for them, for you, and occasionally a red fox too, so we'll also look out for them. which is, lots of cool stuff going on. It's never boring out here. Maybe I'll talk a bit about the environment. So we are on the tundra, and the tundra is an area that's characterized by a short growing season and cold temperatures. So you will see some trees dotting the landscape out here. They're few and far between. And if you do see one, it'll look pretty small, but it could be over 100 years old. They grow very, very slowly out here, but it's pretty cool. A lot of the bushes you'll see are willows. There are just a ridiculous amount of willow species out here. It's pretty cool, and polar bears really like kind of laying in the willows. We get ptarmigan in the willows. Those are like the little Arctic chicken. They're pretty darn cute, so we'll look out for them. But this area, on first glance, it can look kind of bleak or lifeless, but there's just so much going on out here. Okay.
At least I might add too that this is definitely the fall, and had you been up here about 3 weeks earlier, all the little willow bushes and things, their leaves change color before they drop, and so it's it's much like the fall in the Midwest or the western eastern part of North America, in that everything the whole tundra just looks to be on fire with all the different colors. The time, though, is pretty short. You got to catch it just a few days long, and then the wind picks up and all the leaves are gone. But at that time, it is just spectacular here. So I think it just kind of highlights, you really got to look close for the beauty here. I mean, there isn't big mountains and things like that some of us enjoy, or things like that, but it is a really spectacular place if you really get down and look at some of the interesting things that are here.
Yeah, we sure like it. So I want to answer a question first about Aurora, maybe. So Explore.org had, we were following a collared bear this year named Aurora and her 2 cubs. And Aurora actually slipped her collar off, we think, out on the sea ice about mid-year. We have not yet spotted her, but if we ever do again, we are going to be sure to let people know. She could very well be around here. We just haven't seen her this year. Scientists haven't. So we're sure she's doing fine. And hopefully this year we'll have another bear for you guys to follow. And maybe this one will keep its collar on a little bit longer. But it's totally up to the bear. So we'll just have to wait and see. One thing... Yeah, so we don't ever collar adult males. Adult males have very thick necks compared to their heads, and they can just kind of pop the collar off their, I think I've heard their heads and necks referred to as like a pylon shape. It's just thick to thin. Females, their necks are a little bit thinner compared to their skulls, so we can put a collar on them a little easier, but they can still slip them off if they want to most of the time, or especially if they have cubs. Sometimes the cubs aren't really sure what's on mom and want it off, so they'll pull that right off. But it's really a pretty incredible way to get data on polar bears and understand what type of habitat matters to them, so that we can then hopefully conserve that habitat, plan for, if there's ever an oil spill in the Arctic. That collar data really helps inform us of where polar bears are, when and why. And so we can do things like mitigation, we can make plans, action plans, things like that. And just a host of other, our collar data is used for a lot of questions and answers, and it's pretty important. So,
can you tell us a little bit about the collar mechanisms itself and how they're able to just let them drop off too after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, so there are built-in collar mechanisms that, are programmed to fall off at certain times, so that the bear can just get rid of it if it hasn't pulled it off its head yet. And most of the time they work pretty darn well. And there's also some other mechanisms you can build in where if you're close to a polar bear, you have a remote control thing and hit a button and have it fall off. So we try to make sure that collars aren't on bears for too long, and they give us a lot of great data while they are on bears, so they've been pretty important. So let's see what other questions we have. Actually, maybe while I'm looking up more questions, maybe you could talk a little bit about the trail system here and maybe buggies. People are going to be seeing buggies roaming around, and what are they doing, and are they allowed to go anywhere, or what are the buggy rules?
Totally. So there's a handful of buggies out here. In order to operate a buggy, the company has to have a permit. So there's only about 18 buggies out here, something in that neighborhood, less than 20 buggies. They're roaming around here on the shore of Hudson Bay. The 2 main companies, they've got an agreement where everybody stays on an existing trail network that we're told was created by the military when they were here. This is going back to those rocket range days and even earlier when the U.S. military was here at Fort Churchill. So we stay on the trail largely because the Tundra takes a long time to repair itself. If we were to take one of these big heavy vehicles and just roam around wherever we please, we would scar the Tundra, and it would stay that way. And we just want to make sure we can preserve this place, take people out to see this place and help share that with you with the Explore cams, but also make sure we preserve the views that we have for people that will be here in the future. So we'll stay on the trails. You'll see once the lakes start to freeze up, then the buggies will start scooting across the lakes. That is fair game, although we'll have to wait just a little bit longer. We want to make sure we don't have to go swimming to try to retrieve a buggy if it goes through the ice. So that has happened in the past. But yeah, so it's about peak polar bear season here. So the buggies are definitely in full swing. As you see, there's been a couple of them zipping behind us here. Zipping might be a bit of an exaggeration. They don't go that fast, but yeah.
Thanks. Maybe one thing I think's pretty interesting. So you guys will see some Cape cams on the explore.org polar bear cam list there, and Cape is actually a little ways from here. It's more than a few kilometers out, and we only really go there once a year with any buggies, and it's a pretty special spot. And one of the reasons it's so special is because there's a little tower out there that was used by one of the first big polar bear biologists years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about the Cape Tower history and how we came to have cams on there now and why those cams are super cool?
Yeah, definitely. So it's been a project that's near and dear to my heart because I helped kind of restore this tower. But going a long time back, maybe in the, about late 70s, I think, Dr. Ian Sterling, he decided he wanted to look at polar bear behavior and what polar bears do. And so he had a tower erected right outside here at a place called Cape Churchill to look at polar bears. So he could stand in there, or his grad students could sit inside the tower with binoculars and just watch polar bears in their own environment, undisturbed.
There was no internet back then, so.
There was no internet back then. In fact, you can hear they tell wild stories. I mean, this isn't going that far back. Late 70s into the 80s. They had a radio phone out there, or just a radio, and you'd have to, when you're ready for a pickup from an airplane, you'd either have a predetermined date, and if the weather was good, they'd come get you, or you'd have to radio back to town, and hopefully somebody was listening. So it's a lot different now. Now we've spent a lot of time out there refurbishing this tower to make sure it's safe for people to be in, and then hanging the Explore cameras on. So the same views that Dr. Sterling saw in the late 70s, we can now share with the world. On top of that, there's internet out there. So every time I fly out, generally to test the internet, I Skype my dad just to check the connection. And so isn't that a change from the 70s, So yeah, so it's a unique structure. It's about 50 feet tall. It was a fire lookout tower from the southern part of Canada, and Ian Sterling arranged to purchase it, had it set on the side of the railroad tracks, and it was brought up by train to Churchill here, flown out all the way out to Cape Churchill, and then it was put up by the power guys in town. So they have a lot of hydroelectric power here in Manitoba. So the power company is called Manitoba Hydro. The hydro guys erected this tower. Ian Sterling told me you didn't want a bunch of biologists setting up a tower, and that's probably why the tower is still standing. It was pretty strong. Now we had an engineer look at it. We had to fix a few things on it, but it's going strong. And I mean, you've seen these cameras blowing around out here. It's windy here. It's really windy. Last winter, there was a couple days it was blowing 120 kilometers an hour. The tower's still standing, so it's a neat place. Now the tower's in Wapuss National Park. I think in about year 2000 or so, the park was established, and it's a neat place. So check it out on the Explore cameras when you're poking around on the different polar bear cams.
Cool. We were laughing. We've had a couple windstorms since we've been here, and when we're staying even in town, in our houses in town, the toilet's shaking. The toilet water's shaking. And that's when you know it's super windy. Yeah, there's the waves in the toilet. It's pretty darn funny. It's makes sleeping almost comforting in a way. It's like being in a cradle. It's pretty funny. So Yeah, and like we said, when it's pretty windy, the polar bears are likely to do what this guy's doing here, just kind of hunker down, find a bit of a restful spot. If it's calm and super cold, they're pretty happy, but usually when it's a little bit windy, they're more likely to lay down. So that's what we're seeing, but we'll sure let you know if he gets up. He's having a nice nap. So we have another question. Is the ice forming any later or earlier than in the past? And if so, how are the bears adapting? Are they staying in Churchill longer now than in the past? So the ice, compared to 30 or 40 years ago, we do see a trend where the ice is forming later on average and melting earlier on average. So the difference between then and now is about 3 to 4 weeks. And of course, this varies by year. Some years we still have ice that's great for polar bears, but we're seeing more often poor ice years or a shortening ice season overall. So it's really hard to predict what we're going to see year to year, and there's a lot of factors that go into it, but we are seeing a shift over time, absolutely. And we are seeing polar bears respond to this. So we know that female body condition seems a lot more tied to the sea ice than male body condition. So we are seeing changes in females. They are getting smaller, having fewer cubs. And I don't know the stats on the polar bears coming into town, to be honest. I do know that the Polar Bear Alert program in Churchill has been very successful. So Churchill, of course, is right on the shores of Hudson Bay, polar bear capital of the world. And they're seeing, polar bears are coming through town every year. Throughout the kind of spring, summer, fall, and they have ways to deal with this. So they really want to avoid as much human-bear conflict as possible. They want to cut that right down. Sometimes this means hazing a bear to keep it away from town. If there's a problem bear that comes back year after year after year, they may hold it in their polar bear holding facility for up to 30 days. And this is just a safe spot for bad bears who want to get into town. So these bears are held there, and then when the ice comes in or after 30 days, they're flown to a more appropriate area in the region and then released. And then we hope that they don't come back. And we don't want them to come back because, every time, there's a chance for human-bear conflict, it's not good for humans or bears. There's also other communities along the coast of Hudson Bay that are dealing with seeing a lot more bears in town. The community of Arviat in Nunavut is dealing with that right now. They're having a lot more polar bears seen around town, come through town for various reasons. One of the reasons we believe is that the sea ice just isn't around long enough. The bears are being more drawn to maybe the smells, food, or just whatever. They're just on land longer, so they're more likely to get, into human trouble. And we want to cut that down because, well, like I said, we don't want run-ins with polar bears. We want to keep them in their world and us in ours, and just, respecting them as much as possible. And so there's some really great people working on that issue and putting more solutions in place to reduce the amount of bears that are coming into contact with us. And we want to also keep the kids safe. And that's one thing that's coming up. This coming weekend is Halloween. And that's a pretty big deal in Churchill, and I'm sure Arviat too. I know in Churchill they have a lot of extra patrols all day. They're making sure there's no bears anywhere near town so that the kids are allowed to trick-or-treat in peace and have a great time and not have to worry about it. There's
volunteers also park around town, around the perimeter, and sit and watch for bears that could potentially be walking in from the coast. So it's really a community effort to make sure that kids can wander around in their costumes and pick up candy.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Everyone wants kids to have candy on Halloween. Yeah. So yeah, it's a pretty neat community event, actually. Everyone working together. You've volunteered on that before, haven't you?
I volunteered, helped out some of the locals there, watch for bears. It's a pretty simple job. Mostly you're sitting in a vehicle somewhere, just chatting with folks, and looking out the window for bears. So it's pretty fun.
Pretty cool. Yeah. Pretty cool. And yeah, so far all kids in Churchill have been safe, and we're sure that that'll happen again this year. And let me tell you, in Churchill, I've seen some of the best Halloween costumes I've ever seen in my entire life. They take Halloween pretty seriously here. It is pretty darn cool. It's lots of fun, so we're really looking forward to it. What is the current population of humans in Churchill? Is it still around 900 or so? It grows during bear season.
That's the number I hear is 800-900 people.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely, I mean, the polar bears expand a lot farther than the town of Churchill, but there are more polar bears in this population than humans for sure. So, but most of them never really come near to Churchill. We kind of just get a few around here, around Buggy Land, and they don't need to be here. You know, there's a lot of area around here that the buggies are not able to go, but these polar bears seem totally fine with hanging out with us for a while, and they're able to get up and walk away at any point, and we're really grateful that they don't mind our company a lot of the time. So it's pretty nice to be here. Is it true that polar bear skin is black? That is true. Polar bear skin is black. Their fur is actually colorless. We're not 100% sure why their skin is black. Of course, one of the main theories is that it was able to absorb heat better and retain that, and so that's kind of what we go with. But to be honest, it might just be one of those random things that happened and stuck. But yeah, it's kind of cool. Black skin, white fur, or clear fur. Their fur is also hollow, so it can hang on to warm air better, which is kind of neat. Hold it against their body. They've, of course, got really, really thick fur to help insulate them. And they've got many inches of fat, especially when they're healthy bears. And that fat does help insulate them, but is largely used for insulating them in water and also helping buoyancy. Polar bears are really good floaters. They're good divers, but man, they can float. Yeah, they're pretty buoyant. Okay, so let's see what else we can talk about. What other questions do we have? Just scrolling. Do polar bears have any predators? So, not really in the sense of usual predators. Polar bears are top of their food chain in the Arctic ecosystem. Occasionally, we do see them predate each other. So, males may occasionally go after a cub or each other if a polar bear is sick or injured. If a polar bear dies, you know, maybe likely that another bear will eat it. But really, it's polar bears. And then there are some groups of humans that do hunt polar bears. This is the traditional hunting right from a culture that's thousands of years old and has had polar bears as part of their culture, a very important part. And they're really, they really tightly control how many polar bears are taken. It's a very respectful relationship and managed very closely and in line with traditional knowledge as well as science to make sure that they're managed in such a way that we keep polar bears coming back and the populations as healthy as we can in the face of the changing climate. So it's really very limited. Polar bears mostly are doing the hunting. I sure wouldn't want to be a seal out here. That whole breathing hole thing would just, every time you go to take a breath, it might maybe having a polar bear up there. That seems like quite the life. I don't know about that. I'd rather be a polar bear. Do polar bears hunt any small animals while they wait for the ice to form? That's a good question. So, polar bears are pretty quick. They can sprint for at about 30 kilometers an hour for short distances, but it's really not a good use of their energy to hunt a small animal that's maybe a little bit quicker. There's maybe some small mammals out here. I've never seen a polar bear actively go after one. I'm sure if a little mouse or something happened to run into a polar bear paw, the polar bear would happily eat it.
Chasing a muskrat once. Wow, there you go. On one of the ponds here. It was a pretty short chase. The muskrat got away. But, it was kind of neat to see.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Do you think it was for food or for fun?
I think it was bored. Yeah, just needed something to do.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. One of my favorite moment on the cams that's ever happened was a few years ago, and you were there, when we had that polar bear sleeping near the coast, and a wolverine. Oh, I'd never seen a wolverine before, but we had a wolverine run up, just run at this polar bear from quite a distance. Oh, yeah. And it kind of gave it a 1-2 little haze, and the polar bear didn't really seem to know what the heck was going on. It was hilarious. It did. It kind of woke up and it stood up and was kind of like, what the heck is this wolverine doing? And the wolverine kind of looked at it and ran away. Yeah. It was one of the most bizarre wildlife encounters ever. One of my favorites I've ever seen. So I'll keep an eye out for wolverines too, but not for a second did the polar bear seem to consider eating it. It was kind of just a plaything. It was pretty darn funny. I don't know. That was pretty cool. Okay, and we have a question about the polar bear cubs at the zoo in Rennen in the Netherlands. They don't know yet, and they probably will know soon where those cubs are going to go. So the cubs will be leaving the zoo at some point when they're about 1.5 years old. and we'll keep you updated. The zoos over in Europe, everywhere, are so busy in the summer, giving updates. Updates are few and far between, but we're going to try to update you guys more often on what's going on there. I know that they have a wonderful following on those cams, and we're sorry we haven't given you more information, but we are working on it. And I promise this community will be, after the zoo, the first to know about where those cubs are going, and we'll see if maybe even more cams will be set up. So we will keep you updated on them, and also Siku and his family. Keep you updated on what they're doing, because there are some pretty cool polar bears too. And it's so neat to just watch, polar bears have fun and play, and they have some pretty neat surroundings in that zoo. I sure liked watching those cubs grow up. They were just so cute. They had a lot of fun interactions. It was pretty cool. So with that, what else? We have another question. Okay. What is the lifespan of an average polar bear? Can you estimate age when you are handling them? So this is a really cool question. So the oldest polar bear that we know ever lived was Debbie at the Assiniboine Zoo in Winnipeg, and she passed away when she was 42. So that was in captivity. We know that in the wild...
Good health plan, they like to say.
A good health plan?
Yeah, she had a good health plan.
Yeah. One of the people that worked with her is actually a buggy driver now, correct? Yeah.
Yep, Buggy Bob.
Buggy Bob. So we know one of her handlers, and he... do you want to tell the story of what happened when she passed away?
Yeah, Buggy Bob actually, he picked up a career in shooting fireworks after he left the zoo and before he became a buggy driver. So in order to... And Debbie was actually from this area here. Yeah, she was a rescued bear, I think from the Churchill dump maybe. We'll have to ask Bob about that one. I forget the exact details on that one. But anyways, they wanted to return her to the Hudson Bay area. So they took her cremains and they loaded her in a firework, and Bob shot her out over the Hudson Bay. So Debbie returned.
Yeah, Debbie's ashes are all across Hudson Bay. Pretty, and so are her keepers, actually, right? Her favorite keeper, the guy that took care of her for years and years and years. When he passed away, Bob did the same thing and scattered his ashes with Debbie's. So that's a pretty cool thing about this coast that we're on here. That's pretty neat. But anyway, back to the question. So polar bears, females will live longer than males in the wild. Females may live to their maybe late 20s. Males maybe early mid 20s type thing. And the way we age them is pretty neat. So because polar bears go through this period where they're eating a lot and then fasting, they kind of have this growth cycle, which is really similar to a tree, where trees have a growing season and then a decreased growing season. And because of this, their teeth grow in rings. So polar bears have this tiny tooth behind their big canine. We call it a premolar, and it's just this little itty-bitty thing. And biologists are able to pop that out in the field. And they'll only ever do that once, even if they recapture a bear. There's only ever a need to take one tooth. And if we cut that tooth in half, we can actually count the rings on it to find out how old a polar bear is, which is a pretty cool way to figure out age, I think. So we can't do that in humans, but it's a nice way. It does take a while, so that's not something we do right away in the field. We can kind of like roughly estimate how old a bear is in the field. We'll know if it's a coy or a yearling. We'll know if it's a subadult, so that's between the ages of about 2 and 5, 3 and 5, and then we can kind of guess if it's an adult and an old adult, or maybe a teenage bear or something like that. But we do have to wait to get the tooth results back to find out their actual age, and then if we ever capture the bear again, we just kind of extrapolate the age from their original tooth. So pretty neat. So I think we will start our wrap up now. Thank you guys for the questions. We just love this explorer community. The enthusiasm to see these bears is just really kind of heartwarming, and it makes us love our job even more. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do this season. So for those of you that weren't with us last season, PBI has a couple different things that we do. So we do these live chats, and this year we will be doing them between Monday and Friday. And we're going to be doing this for about the next 3 to 4 weeks. So we'll see how long bear season goes for, but definitely the next 3 weeks and maybe after that. And the schedule is posted online, and we also will have reminders for people when there will be a live chat. And we'll be having different experts come in. So, and unfortunately, won't be BJ every time, but we will get other sea ice experts in. Thank you, Jen, for today. We have some people that live and work with polar bears. We have
just all sorts of cool guests coming up, and we will try to get people on camera as much as we can. We are also going to try, so for those of you that watched the Beluga Cam, you saw that Haley had a headset and she was able to do a little more live narration as things were happening. And we're going to see if we can get that working this year. I'm not going to promise anything, but if we can, we're going to try to get that headset working. So if something super cool is happening and there's no live chat scheduled, we can still hop on air and talk about it and let you know what's going on in real time. So we're pretty excited about that. At PBI, we also have educational programming, which I talked about early on. We call it our Tundra Connections program. And we have set webcasts that are largely aimed at schools, but also zoos and just members of the general public that have themes and certain topics we're talking about. So, for example, a lot of this week, our Tundra Connections will be focused on climate change and polar bears and the talks in Paris that are coming up this December and how that all kind of fits together. And we're also talking to kids from the north and kind of connecting what's happening in their backyards to places all over the world, which is pretty cool. The first week of November is Polar Bear Week, so that's really exciting for us. We've got just a polar bear extravaganza of fantastic people that are here. We're going to be doing some really fun broadcasting. It should be super cool, so check out that. We also have challenges during that week and all sorts of ways you can get involved. And then our last week is with Discovery Education, and we have some really fun webcasts for kids that week. But again, also for adults, we've got a segment about polar bears and penguins, and also one about the growler bear, the grizzly polar hybrid, so stay tuned for that. And we will be in the chat windows as much as we can, weekend and weekday. And we'll keep these live cams going and be working constantly to find you the best bear shots and keeping you up to date on polar bears and answering your questions throughout the season. Is there anything you want to add?
I just want to say thanks to Explore and to all you viewers out there tuning in. Look forward to chatting with you here over the next couple of weeks.
Totally. Yeah, and again, we'd love to thank explore.org. Without them, this wouldn't happen, so they're just wonderful. Thank you so much. Also, Frontiers North Adventures, who donates Buggy One to us throughout the season so we can do these things. And they also own the Tundra Buggy Lodge, where a lot of our scientists and ourselves stay at night, and they feed us, and they're just great hosts. And also Parks Canada for helping us out with the Cape Cam Towers, amongst many other things. They're a great organization or governmental group. And the CNSC, the Churchill Northern Study Center, for hosting the new Aurora Cam. So we've got a lot of great people we're working with. And of course, thank you to the viewers, because none of this would happen if you guys weren't interested. So we sure look forward to getting to know you guys better and answering your questions for the next few weeks. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
We will talk to you soon.